It was a clear and sunny day. High above the vast blue sky, a wyvern flew in graceful circles, freer than anything No.1 had ever seen. Watching that creature soar, he realized something deep within himself. That moment alone was enough for him, No.1, of the great magical house Declan, to decide that he would retire as a troubleshooter. It was the one and only reason. Earlier that same day, the sky had turned gray and heavy, the air thick with the sound of crows cawing as they flew overhead. Down below, on the ground, two men struggled violently. One man had his hand raised, strangling another with magic. His cold voice echoed through the field as he declared that the man before him was the last one left. The man being strangled gasped and struggled, barely able to speak through the tightening grip of the spell. He accused his attacker of hiding his true strength, saying that such power was far beyond what any mere troubleshooter should possess. No.1 only smirked at the words. He reached behind his back and pulled out a thick tome, its ancient surface glowing faintly with magic. With calm arrogance, he told the man that he would be the one asking questions. Holding the tome up, he examined it closely, and remarked with curiosity that it appeared to be a magic tome. The strangled man, still choking, confirmed it with difficulty. He said that they had not come all this way just to take down a single hunting dog. No.1's grin widened as he mocked him, saying that if it was House Declan's trash he was dealing with, it made sense that an entire pack would come after him. Then, as his tone turned inquisitive, he asked how the tome was supposed to be used. The man's voice trembled as he replied that he did not know. No.1 stared at the tome again, muttering to himself. If the greedy Declan knew how to use it, he thought, they never would have buried it in that dusty old basement. They didn't even understand its power, yet they had chased him all this way for it. That meant the tome was worth far more than anyone imagined. The dying man tried to negotiate. He told No.1 to hand over the tome, and promised to ask the head of Declan to show mercy, maybe even allow him to return to being a troubleshooter. No.1 grinned mockingly and asked what power a mere troubleshooter manager had to grant such mercy. The man fell silent at that. After a moment, No.1 sighed and asked if the man had any last words. The magical force around the man's neck tightened brutally. He choked out a curse, but No.1 only smirked and said that it was admirable he had finally accepted his identity. Then, suddenly, No.1 froze. His instincts screamed danger. From behind him, a presence appeared without a sound. He turned his head slightly, eyes widening in alarm. A calm, confident voice broke the silence. "You've got pretty good instincts." The man who appeared stepped forward, leaning on an elegant cane. With a composed smile, he introduced himself as Farron von Declan, head of the magical house Declan of the Eastern Continent. No.1's heart pounded as he assessed the man's aura. It was suffocatingly strong, more vicious than anything he had ever felt. His thoughts raced. The head of House Declan himself. Farron von Declan smiled faintly as he stepped closer, his tone calm yet commanding. He said that he would like to take the tome from No.1, and that they could talk afterward. No.1 looked at him with disbelief. He thought to himself that it had been more than a decade since he had first become a troubleshooter. He had spent half his life under House Declan, yet this was his first time seeing the head in person. House Declan, the most powerful magical family in the Eastern Continent, was led by a man said to be the strongest mage in its long history. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of person such a man truly was. A faint smirk crossed his lips as he muttered aloud, "What a pain in the ass." Farron von Declan froze for a moment, caught off guard by the bold remark. No.1 continued with a grin, accusing him of being shameless for trying to take another man's hard-earned loot so easily. For a moment, there was silence. Then Farron von Declan burst into laughter, deep, booming laughter that echoed across the field. The very air seemed to tremble under the weight of his magical pressure. No.1 laughed nervously as his body trembled under that oppressive power. He muttered to himself that perhaps he should not have eaten that wyvern back then. Of course the head himself had to show up, he thought. What terrible luck. The man's aura was overwhelming, easily the most powerful he had ever encountered. Farron von Declan stomped his cane into the ground, his expression sharpening. He admitted it would be easier to simply kill No.1 and take the tome again, but decided to get straight to the point. With a grin, he offered him a deal. He told No.1 to come back under Declan's wing, to hand over the tome, and that he would overlook everything that had happened. He praised No.1's talent, saying that after watching him fight, it was hard to believe such ability had gone unnoticed. He called him a filthy stray from the gray zone who had mastered trash techniques used only by troubleshooters, yet somehow possessed incredible skill. He told him to imagine what heights he could reach with House Declan as his wings. Together, they could make Declan greater than ever before. He promised that No.1 would go down in history, side by side with him if he returned. But of course, he added, the tome would have to be returned. No.1 stood silently for a moment, then finally said, "Fine." Farron von Declan smiled broadly at his answer and began to speak again, but before he could finish, No.1 interrupted him with a grin and added a condition. He told him to give him the head seat of House Declan, and then he would consider returning. The smile on Farron von Declan's face remained, but the fury behind his eyes was unmistakable. No.1, still holding his smirk, reminded him that he had been watching the fight earlier. His magic flared suddenly as he clenched his fist, tightening the magical grip around the man he had been strangling earlier. The man screamed in agony as the invisible force crushed his throat, and in an instant, he died. No.1 looked back at Farron von Declan, and asked coldly if he could even count how many had died by his hands. Farron's expression turned grave. He warned him that if he continued down this path, he might die. No.1 narrowed his eyes and silently agreed. The head wasn't wrong, but with a wild grin, he leapt forward and shouted that the man was absolutely right. He launched himself toward Farron von Declan, firing a torrent of magical energy. The head of Declan barely moved, calmly raising his hand to cast a barrier that easily absorbed the attack. No.1 grew frustrated. He poured more magic into his assault, laughing madly as he shouted that one could never know what was longer or shorter until they measured it. Farron von Declan remained calm, and responded that some things simply didn't need to be measured. He raised his hand again. A glowing magic circle formed beneath his palm, and the ground itself responded. Jagged rocks erupted upward, hurling toward No.1 mid-air with lethal force. Farron's calm eyes never wavered as he increased the intensity of his magic. No.1 gritted his teeth, barely blocking the attack, and cursed under his breath, calling him a crazy bastard. He cancelled his spell, landed roughly on the ground, and moved aside to avoid being completely consumed by the attack. His mind raced. So this is the head of Declan. There's not a single opening in his defense. Farron's voice broke through his thoughts, taunting him for being distracted. No.1 charged forward again, slamming into the barrier with renewed determination. Farron only smiled faintly and reminded him of his earlier words. Didn't he say that one had to measure to know? There were some things, Farron said, that one simply knew without measuring. A massive magic circle flared before Farron as he prepared his next spell. He said calmly that this was just like the gap between the two of them. No.1's eyes widened in horror as the overwhelming magic detonated before him. A thunderous explosion followed, shaking the earth. When the dust settled, Farron stood calmly, his gaze steady. He said he hadn't killed him, only roughed him up. Then he asked if No.1 was finally ready to talk. Bloodied and barely standing, No.1 glared back and asked what would happen if he bowed his head now. What if he agreed to return to Declan's shadow? Farron smirked and said he wouldn't believe him. Blue magic flared around No.1's body. His blood dripped onto the scorched ground as he grinned, preparing another attack. He shouted that there was no reason Farron would ever believe him anyway. Magic circles formed around him, one in front, one behind. Power surged violently as he screamed that he was done eating dog food. He launched a massive bolt of electric magic like a bullet toward Farron von Declan, shouting furiously that he had no desire to go back to being a dog. He roared that just because the leash was shiny and the house was big, didn't mean it wasn't still a kennel. Farron von Declan stood motionless, his barrier absorbing the full brunt of the attack. His voice was cold as he muttered one word: pathetic. Then, suddenly, a gigantic magic circle appeared across the ground, covering the entire field. He looked down upon No.1 and declared that he would show him overwhelming power. No.1's expression turned to terror as he looked up at the sky. A massive bolt of thunder fell from above, striking him where he stood. As his vision dimmed, his thoughts returned to that wyvern flying freely in the sky. That had been the reason he looked up that day, the reason he decided to stop being a troubleshooter. Now, with blood pouring down his face, No.1 slumped against a rock, his vision blurring. Farron von Declan approached slowly and looked down at him with faint amusement. He told him he was impressed, that he had expected him to die but he had held out longer than anticipated. He asked if he now understood the difference in their power. No.1 looked up weakly and said that he was insanely strong. Farron von Declan asked again if he was ready to talk, wondering if he wanted to finish what had been left unsaid. No.1 asked if he was being told to become a troubleshooter again. Farron shook his head. He said he wasn't asking him to be a troubleshooter. He wanted him to become the head of the Bongshin family. No.1's eyes widened in shock. The head of the Bongshin family? He knew what that meant. House Declan, the Eastern Continent's greatest magical clan, was powerful enough to challenge even the throne itself, and now they wanted him to swear loyalty as one of their vassal families. He pulled out the tome from his magical inventory, glaring at it. He accused Farron of making this his true goal all along. Farron smirked down at him and told him he was still underestimating his own worth. He said he wanted both him and the tome. No.1 extended his hand, offering the tome. Farron smiled, satisfied, and reached out to take it. He told No.1 that he had made the right choice. Once the tome was returned, all his crimes would be forgiven. He said that all that remained was the glory of standing with Declan. But before Farron could touch it, purple flames erupted from the tome. His expression shattered in disbelief as the book burned before his eyes. He demanded to know what No.1 was doing. No.1 smirked, his eyes gleaming with defiance. He asked what it looked like. After all, Farron had said he could give it to him, if he didn't mind it being reduced to ashes. Rage filled Farron's voice as he told him that he would never be allowed to die easily. No.1 interrupted him, telling him to shut up and listen. He said he had never done this for money. Being a troubleshooter didn't pay well anyway. The reason he had kept the tome, he explained, was because it was tied to money in another way. He asked if Farron had ever heard of the troubleshooter who was eaten by Declan's young master. Farron's eyes widened. He whispered, "Forbidden magic." No.1 nodded, saying that the young master had devoured his teammates, and that Declan had covered it up. Farron asked if this was about revenge. No.1 laughed and told him no. He said he knew that troubleshooters' lives were cheap, and so had his teammates. He wasn't doing this for vengeance. He simply wanted to make sure they got what they wanted, but that required a great deal of money. He said he had finally made up his mind to retire, and there was no way he was crawling back into the kennel. Farron turned away, his tone flat as he told him to consider that his last words. With a snap of his fingers, a blue flame engulfed No.1. As the fire consumed him, Farron said that it was Declan's prized blue flame, a fire that never died out. He looked back at No.1 one last time and told him to burn in it, to regret his choice with every fiber of his being. No.1 screamed through the pain, shouting that he would regret nothing. He glared at Farron's back as he walked away, the blue flames tearing through his body. If the only other option was being Declan's dog again, he thought, then he would rather return to the gray zone. And if he couldn't even do that, then dying wasn't such a bad deal. He began laughing uncontrollably, his voice echoing through the burning air. He muttered that he hadn't felt this free in forever. It was a shame he wouldn't escape alive, but at least he had no regrets. If he were ever born again, he swore, he would find freedom and seek revenge properly next time. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. The flames froze mid-motion. The air grew silent. No.1 blinked in confusion, looking around in disbelief. He muttered to himself, asking what was happening. Everything had stopped completely. His eyes fell to the tome floating in front of him. He reached toward it in awe and whispered, "The tome?" As it hovered before him, a bright magic circle formed on his chest, glowing faintly with mysterious light. He stared down at it in alarm, his voice trembling as he demanded to know what was happening. "What the hell is this?" Then, in a sudden flash, No.1's perspective shifted. He found himself kneeling in the corner of a dim alleyway, holding out a small container as he begged on the streets. His expression turned to shock as confusion filled his mind. He muttered under his breath, wondering what was happening. Just moments ago he had been burning to death. He was certain of it. Yet now, everything felt strange. Unreal even. He looked around, taking in the grimy walls, the damp ground, and the faint scent of sewage in the air. The realization slowly crept in as he whispered to himself, asking where he was. Everything looked familiar, painfully familiar. Then it struck him. He remembered this place. The narrow alleys, the shadowed corners. It was the gray zone, the miserable district where he had begged for scraps every day before he became a troubleshooter. He looked down at his own hands and body, noticing how young he appeared. The sight startled him. He questioned if he had truly gone back in time. Later, standing near the sewage drain, he stared at his reflection in the murky water. The face looking back was undoubtedly his own, but younger. Far too young. He noticed the fire-shaped mark still etched into his chest and frowned. Even after this mysterious regression, the strange magic circle had remained. Sitting down on an open field, No.1 tried to piece together what had happened. He muttered to himself that the magic tome must have done something, but could that ancient artifact really perform such a feat? He recalled the head of the Declan family personally seeking it, a man so notoriously lazy that his personal appearance alone meant it held great importance. That fact alone spoke volumes about the tome's power. Yet, despite its significance, little information existed about it. No.1 sighed and brushed the thought aside. Whatever it was, the outcome seemed favorable enough. The air, the smell, the ground beneath him, it was all far too vivid to be a dream. Even the foul stench of sewage from Syle's lecture hall was unmistakably real. He clenched his fists, a grin forming on his face as he declared that he was alive. Truly alive. This was a new beginning. Anything he did from this point could lead to success. He tilted his head back, gazing up at the sky, and asked himself what success truly meant. A faint smile crossed his lips as he recalled his old dream, the same dream shared with his comrades. It was the dream that had led him to retire in the first place. His thoughts drifted to a memory long past, one where he had been talking with a close comrade. His friend had called out to him, using his real name, Aster. They had spoken about their origins, how they were both born as vagrants in the gray zone. They had nothing. They could not dress properly, eat enough, or receive an education. His comrade had asked which of those struggles had hurt the most. Aster, absent-mindedly picking his nose, had answered that hunger was the worst. His comrade had disagreed, saying that if hunger alone had been the problem, they would not have ended up living in filth. He demanded to know what Aster truly thought had dragged them down into that gutter of a life. Aster had brushed him off, insisting he was fine with it. Annoyed, his comrade pressed harder, shouting that the true reason they suffered was their lack of education. Aster, finally relenting under the man's glare, sighed and admitted that being uneducated had been the bitterest part of their lives. His comrade then spoke with conviction, saying that if they had learned and studied, they wouldn't have lived as slaves to those arrogant noble families. He had said that if he ever retired, he wanted to build something. A library. In the present, No.1 finished his comrade's sentence aloud. He said he wanted to build a library, a place where anyone could read freely regardless of their wealth, status, or gender. But he wanted to go further than that. He wanted to build a tower, a tall, magnificent structure filled with books of every kind. He had no specific reason, he simply liked tall things. The location didn't matter. Inside that tower, he would collect all sorts of books, but one in particular was essential: the Declan family's secret manual. He imagined placing it right at the entrance on the first floor, so that even the poorest vagrants, illegitimate noble children, or butchers' sons could freely take a copy. The cover would bear the Declan crest, and inside would be the secret techniques that family guarded more than their own lives. Just picturing it made him grin with excitement. The only problem was figuring out how to obtain such a manual. He dismissed the concern, laughing it off as a problem for his future self. If he could somehow spread Declan's techniques across the world, everyone in the gray zone would worship him for it. But just as he was lost in his daydream, a sudden kick struck him square in the face, sending him sprawling to the ground. A furious young man towered over him, shouting that he had finally found him. No.1 curled up on the ground as the man continued to kick him, yelling that he had been saving a seat for him, only for Aster to hide away instead. The attacker demanded to know if he wanted to die. Trying to protect his face, Aster muttered to himself in confusion, wondering who this man was. Was it an ambush? No, it couldn't be. He had survived countless battles, everything except aerial warfare. He was a seasoned troubleshooter. He suddenly grabbed the young man's foot, making the attacker glare down in disbelief. The man barked angrily, asking if Aster dared to block him. Aster rose slightly from the ground, glaring back. He calmly pointed out that the man had hit him 7 times, and in a cold, steady tone, he declared that he would return 70 in kind. As he drew his fist back for an uppercut, a loud cracking sound echoed from his wrist. Shocked, Aster froze and stared at his hand. His wrist was glowing faintly, and confusion clouded his face as he flexed it in disbelief. But before he could make sense of it, the man punched him across the face, shouting that Aster had dared to hit his big bro. Aster fell again, and the beating resumed. The young man kicked him repeatedly, yelling in rage. Pain shot through Aster's body, but the ache in his heart hurt even more. Then, as fate would have it, the attacker stepped on a small stone, lost his balance, and tumbled straight into the nearby sewage. Seizing the opportunity, Aster quickly got to his feet. He muttered to himself that this was his chance and bolted. The attacker spat out sewage water and shouted after him, demanding to know where he thought he was running. As Aster ran, he reminded himself that this wasn't cowardice, it was a tactical retreat. He stopped briefly, turned back with a cold, unwavering gaze, and declared that he would remember the man's face. Then he sprinted off again, telling himself that the hits he'd taken would serve as medals of experience. He was a veteran troubleshooter, a man who did not understand the meaning of quit. Later, sitting in a narrow alleyway, Aster winced as he clutched his right arm. He muttered that the injury was serious. He wasn't some paper pusher, yet his wrist had sprained just from punching someone. His body was far too weak. He sighed, telling himself to forget about his body for now. But before he could continue his thoughts, a small voice spoke beside him, asking if he was hungry. Turning his head, Aster saw a young boy staring curiously at him. After a brief pause, he asked the boy if he knew him. The boy shook his head and replied that he didn't. Aster examined the child carefully. The boy's clothes were too fine for this area, suggesting he was a noble's son who had fallen from grace. In other words, he was a walking, delicate bomb waiting to explode. Aster told the boy bluntly to leave, but the child quickly introduced himself as Damien. Aster barely acknowledged it, muttering that he didn't care. Damien continued anyway, saying that his mother's name was Bianca. Aster paused, feeling increasingly irritated, and muttered to himself that he was learning things he'd rather not know. He asked aloud if the boy was perhaps not right in the head. Damien calmly replied that he didn't have a mother. Aster awkwardly apologized, then added that he didn't have a father either, so he won. He told Damien to go his own way, waving him off and muttering that it was best not to get involved with trouble like that. But Damien stayed by his side, staring silently. After a while, Aster asked if he was planning to leave. Damien simply said that he was going with him. Aster groaned inwardly, wondering if he should smack the kid. He told him firmly to go away. Instead, Damien extended his hand toward him and asked if his arm hurt. As a magical circle began to form on the boy's palm, he offered to heal it. Aster's eyes widened in shock. He recognized the magic immediately. Damien smiled brightly and announced that it was magic touch. But Aster knew better. That wasn't just a basic healing spell. It was the light of healing. A secret technique belonging to the Blando family, the same house that had fallen because of Declan. His troubleshooter instinct screamed that this situation was dangerous. Something dark and troublesome had just entwined itself around his fate. He wondered why a Blando child would be in the gray zone at all, especially when at this time, the Blando family should still have been powerful. He muttered the boy's name under his breath, Damien. When Damien heard it, he tilted his head innocently and asked if Aster had called him. Then he smiled, eyes gleaming, and responded cheerfully. Realization hit Aster like a thunderclap. His expression turned to horror as he finally remembered who Damien truly was. A member of the Blando bloodline with heterochromatic eyes. The monster of Blando. The mad butcher who would not die, no matter how many times he was killed. Damien von Blando. The boy sat down cheerfully beside him, his attention captured by the ants crawling across the dirt. Counting aloud, he said with delight that there were 2 ants. Aster could only stare at him in disbelief, muttering to himself in frustration and disbelief at the absurdity of what was happening. Aster recalled a distant memory from before his regression, a time when he still worked as a troubleshooter. Back then, he had been dispatched to the Blander family under the orders of the House of Declan. As he and his comrade rushed toward their destination, Aster had grumbled in frustration, wondering aloud why the Blanders couldn't handle their own problems. His companion only shrugged and reminded him that it wasn't their place to question the higher-ups. He mentioned that there were rumors of a monster at the Soft Estate, a creature said to have killed dozens. Aster raised a brow at that and asked if it was something like an ogre. When they finally arrived, however, his eyes widened in disbelief. What he saw was far worse than any monster he could have imagined. It wasn't a beast, but a man, tearing another person apart with his bare hands, while casting Soft's unique healing magic again and again. The figure fought while laughing maniacally, drenched in blood and insanity. It was the infamous monster of Blander, the mad butcher who wouldn't die even when killed. Damien von Blander. As that memory shattered in his mind, Aster returned to the present, his gaze settling on the same Damien, now crouched on the ground and counting ants like a child. Aster muttered quietly to himself, wondering how someone like Damien, the direct descendant of the Blander family and the only son of the head, could end up living in such a shabby place. Damien suddenly stood up with an excited grin and shouted, "Food!" Aster blinked in confusion and asked what he meant. Damien replied cheerfully that his mother had told him that to stay healthy, one must eat well. He said Aster was sick because he didn't eat enough. Aster thought to himself that Damien was right, even if he didn't mean to punch him with that statement. He sighed and asked if Damien had any money. Without hesitation, Damien pulled out a pouch filled to the brim with glittering gold coins. Aster froze for a moment at the sight, then quickly wrapped an arm around Damien's shoulder with a serious tone. He called his name, and when Damien turned to him curiously, Aster gave him a thumbs up and said with a grin, "We're friends." Damien looked puzzled and asked if that was sudden. Aster declared that if he said they were friends, then they were, and that friends should share what they have. Damien stared at him suspiciously for a moment, but before he could say anything else, Aster's stomach growled, and he raised his voice eagerly, drooling at the thought. "Let's go, friend. Time to eat?" Damien laughed brightly and shouted in response, "Friend!" As the two walked off together, they began to chat like old companions. Damien asked what Aster had, and Aster replied with a smirk, saying he had a friend. Damien found the line impressive and said it was cool. Later, after a hearty meal, they checked into an inn. Aster sat on his bed, patting his full stomach, and sighed contentedly, saying that it had been a good meal. After washing up, he felt refreshed. He noticed Damien wandering around the room, looking around with fascination, and asked what he was doing. Damien replied that he didn't know there was a house above the place they had eaten at. It was his first time realizing that people could sleep indoors. He explained that he had always slept outside. Aster nodded, understanding, but before he could say anything, Damien climbed onto the bed on all fours and suddenly said with a serious expression that he didn't have a father either. Aster paused before replying quietly that he actually did have one. Damien stubbornly insisted he didn't. Aster sighed inwardly, telling himself not to turn it into a competition. Out loud, he asked Damien if he at least had a mother. Damien looked around the room as if searching for her and asked, "Where?" "She's not here." Aster covered his face with his palm and muttered under his breath that if someone wasn't present, Damien just assumed they didn't exist. He admitted to himself that the kid's logic was intense and decided to assess the situation further. He asked how long Damien had been alone. Damien began counting with his fingers before replying that since he ran away from his family, he had slept 10 times. Aster frowned at the word "ran away," wondering if Damien was being chased. He asked if 10 sleeps meant 10 days. Damien replied that he napped a lot, twice a day in fact, and that by 10 sleeps he meant 10 total naps. Aster sighed and concluded that it had been around 3 or 4 days. Damien lay down on the bed and said that he hadn't napped since arriving here because the ground outside had been too uncomfortable. Aster stared blankly for a moment before turning his head toward the nearby pillow. Without hesitation, he buried his face into it, thinking that a madman truly was different from the start. Still, he reasoned that while the boy remained stuck in the gray zone, acting as his caretaker might not be such a bad idea. Forming a connection with the Blander family could prove useful later when facing Declan. Prestigious families also had plenty of books and magical knowledge. But before all that, he had something else to deal with, the 57 grudges carved deep into his heart. He sat up and told Damien not to bother him because he was going to lie down. If Damien did, it would become a big problem. Damien sat up as well and asked with a cheerful face if Aster was practicing his breathing. Aster replied that he was, and told Damien to do the same after he was finished. Damien agreed enthusiastically. Aster then closed his eyes and began his breathing exercises, his mind focusing on his past life. He remembered how his magical foundation had been built through the standard issue spells given to troubleshooters, but he had quickly reached their limits. To surpass them, he had infiltrated various noble houses, stealing their spells and techniques, nearly dying multiple times in the process. He had learned diverse arts, the hardened body technique used by knights, spirit magic, summoning, alchemy, and more. Yet right before his death, he had encountered a power so overwhelming it could only be described as catastrophic. This time, he swore to master that power properly. Declan's foundational art, the Heavenly Origin technique. It was the root art of all Declan's spells, capable of accommodating all attributes of mana. He had memorized it once for research, and now, he would finally use it, the true breathing technique. Suddenly, the magic circle engraved on his chest flared to life, glowing fiercely as heat spread through his entire body. Aster's eyes widened, and he clenched his teeth as waves of agony coursed through him. It felt as though lava was flowing through his veins. He struggled to focus, forcing his mind to operate the technique as intended. Then, he noticed something dark and smoky leaving his body. Impurities. He realized with shock that it was a high-level purification process used only by the elite mages of noble families, and exclusively among direct bloodlines. The spell was called Mana Shower, a technique that forced mana to flow violently through the circuits, burning away all impurities. After what felt like an eternity of suffering, Aster gasped for air and sat up, drenched in sweat and breathing heavily. He wondered how much time had passed, then glanced over at Damien, who was sound asleep. He muttered to himself that his mana circuits were now clean, his mana purer than ever, perhaps even more refined than in his previous life. Even so, he admitted that defeating Declan might still be impossible, no matter how many times he was reborn. But one thing was certain: his chances had just increased. He reminded himself that he had always been a troubleshooter, a man who never gave up, even when the odds were near zero. The next morning, Aster gave Damien a complete makeover. Damien stared at his reflection with excitement, noting that his hair had turned brown. Aster nodded to himself, satisfied that the platinum hair was hidden, and that Damien's clothes were changed enough to disguise him from the Blander family. Now, he thought, the only thing left to do was… Damien interrupted his thoughts with a cheerful question, asking what they would do next. Aster paused, then smiled slyly and said, "We're going to cause some chaos." Elsewhere in the gray zone, the man who had previously beaten Aster stretched and yawned as he looked up at the bright sky, commenting on the nice weather. His attention soon shifted when he saw Aster and Damien approaching from a distance. He frowned, calling out to Aster with mock irritation, asking where he had run off to. He mocked Aster's filthy appearance, joking that he must have bathed in a sewer, and then pointed at Damien, wondering who the rich-looking brat beside him was. Before he could say another word, Aster stepped forward and drove a solid punch straight into the man's stomach. The impact sent him collapsing to the ground instantly. Aster stood over him and coldly declared that he had found the right place, and that since the man still appeared in his memory, he would receive 123 hits first. The surrounding kids, startled by the commotion, turned toward the noise. One of them shouted in surprise, asking what was happening. Another called out to their fallen comrade, Spotty, demanding to know if someone had broken in. 10 kids appeared in front of Aster and Damien, blocking their path. One of them pointed at Aster and shouted in shock, realizing it was the youngest member of their group. Aster grinned widely, his blood boiling with anticipation. All the faces before him were familiar, none of them remotely intimidating. He wondered to himself just how far he could go today. Beside him, Damien looked around in awe and asked innocently, "Wow, is this playing friend?" Without warning, Aster suddenly began throwing punches, striking each of his opponents with a wide grin on his face. His movements were sharp and precise, each blow landing with satisfying impact. On the side, Damien stood watching in pure amazement as Aster beat up the group of kids who had dared to stand against him. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he exclaimed in admiration that it was incredible. Aster was using mana, clenching his fists tightly, and striking rapidly without pause. Aster, still in the midst of the fight, called out to him between punches and said that what Damien was witnessing was what people called awesome. Damien's excitement grew even more, and he cheered loudly, shouting that it was awesome. One of the beaten kids collapsed right in front of Damien. The young boy crouched down beside the fallen child, a cheerful smile spreading across his face. Extending his hand toward him, a magic circle began to form beneath his palm as he spoke gently, assuring the kid that it wouldn't hurt and that he would heal him. Aster, still standing behind them, grabbed the kid by the collar and lifted him up. The boy, now partially healed and dazed, stammered his thanks toward Damien. Leaning close from behind, Aster grinned and asked the boy in a low tone how many times he had been hit. As the hours passed and the sun began to set, the beating continued relentlessly. Several of the kids lay sprawled on the ground, completely exhausted and bruised. Aster, now shirtless and drenched in sweat, stood in front of them, breathing heavily from exertion. He gave a sharp smack to the rear of the kid he had first fought, asking mockingly how many times he had been hit. The boy clutched his aching backside and stammered nervously that he had forgotten. Aster called out for Damien, addressing him as friend. Damien turned toward him joyfully, asking if it was finally his turn. Humming cheerfully, he began to chant, "Heal hands play, heal hands play," as he prepared his magic. The kid on the ground turned pale, muttering in horror for them to stop, but Aster only grinned wider, cracking his knuckles as he crouched closer. He told the kid to listen carefully and said that they were the box-shoulder generation, asking if he understood. Meanwhile, Damien happily continued humming the same cheerful tune while casting his healing spell, repeating, "Heal hands play, heal hands play." The kid screamed internally, trembling as he thought desperately for them to stop, calling them devils. He couldn't bear it anymore and shouted inwardly that he could only count up to 2 digits. By the time night fell, the beating had finally stopped. Aster had the battered kids line up in front of him, and with a calm but commanding tone, he thanked them for their effort that day. All the kids instantly straightened up and shouted in unison, their voices trembling, "The thank you for today." Aster nodded with satisfaction and smiled proudly, saying that their energy was well placed and that he felt proud. Damien stood beside him, happily clapping his hands and adding that everything was done and that they should play again sometime. Aster thought to himself that he was proud as well. After all, he had managed to deliver over 100 hits per person, totaling more than 1,000 in all. It had been a new challenge, even for a seasoned troubleshooter like him, who had experienced nearly every form of combat except mountain battles and aerial warfare. The boy who had originally beaten Aster up stepped forward, his voice trembling with respect as he asked softly if they could go now. He said he thought they had had enough. Aster nodded casually and told him that they could leave. However, the boy hesitated before explaining awkwardly that this was actually his house. Aster turned to him with a feigned look of surprise and asked mockingly if the boy wanted them to leave. His expression then darkened into a glare as he said that would be quite difficult, wouldn't it? The kid panicked, waving his hands frantically as he shouted that wasn't what he meant and that they would just back off instead. As the beaten kids hurried away, Aster watched them leave and thought to himself that what he saw in their eyes wasn't resentment, it was something far more complicated. He found the feeling oddly difficult to describe. Suddenly, his train of thought was cut off. His expression sharpened as he sensed something approaching. He turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he muttered that someone was coming, and fast. The presence was quiet, but distinct. It was unique, familiar even. like that of a trained troubleshooter. He turned his gaze toward Damien, concluding that it was probably a pursuer. He had been careful not to draw attention, so he wondered how they had managed to find him. The thought of the Blander family sending someone to retrieve Damien crossed his mind, and he clicked his tongue in frustration, thinking that he couldn't believe they had located him first. Lifting his right hand slightly, he began to gather mana into his palm. His body still hadn't recovered enough for proper spellcasting or direct combat, and he acknowledged that his current mana reserves were low. But then he reminded himself that scarcity of mana was nothing new to him. Even back when he was a troubleshooter, he had often faced situations like this. Unfavorable, exhausting, yet never impossible. Crackling energy began to form in his right hand, light flickering between his fingers. He focused intensely, compressing the mana over and over until it was dense and unstable. A small magic circle appeared at the tip of his finger. Looking at it, he murmured that this much was enough. He then sat down, extended his arm, and aimed his hand forward like a gun toward the direction of the approaching presence. He steadied his breathing and whispered that this would be his only chance. Moments later, the figure appeared, rushing toward him at incredible speed. Just as Aster prepared to fire, the person suddenly dropped to his knees mid-run, sliding across the ground until he came to a halt right in front of them. Aster froze, eyes wide in confusion, as the man shouted at the top of his lungs, "Goodness, young master!" Damien's entire body jolted in shock as he recognized the voice. His eyes widened, and he shouted the man's name in disbelief. Alfredo?" Alfredo stopped his slide and knelt directly before Damien, grabbing his arms tightly. Tears welled up in the old butler's eyes as he cried out that he didn't know how long he had been searching for him. He asked where Damien had been and what he had been doing, his voice trembling as he shouted that this poor butler hadn't slept a wink from worry over the young master. Damien struggled to push him away, exclaiming for him to let go, but Alfredo refused, hugging Damien even tighter as he declared that he wouldn't release him until he returned to the family. He cried that Damien might as well kill him instead, for he couldn't bear to let the young master stay away any longer. Aster watched from behind with a look of clear disgust, grimacing at the overly dramatic reunion. After a while, Alfredo lifted Damien and carried him in his arms like a piece of luggage. Damien pouted and struggled, clearly unhappy with being carried. The butler, however, turned to Aster with a polite bow and said that he must apologize for making such a fuss in front of a guest. He introduced himself formally as Alfredo, the butler of the Blander family. Aster nodded and introduced himself in return, saying his name was Aster. Alfredo smiled warmly and remarked that it seemed the young master was very fond of Aster. He then suggested that if Aster didn't mind, he should come with them to the Blander estate. The proposal made Aster tense. He thought carefully about it. The Blander family was known for their noble pride and their strict avoidance of anything or anyone they deemed unclean or beneath them. He couldn't quite discern their true intentions behind the offer. But then, a sly grin crept across his face as he concluded that it didn't matter. He had planned to form a connection with the Blander family anyway, and their territory lay on the path leading to the city where Zenian Academy, the best academy in the East, was located. Its library was said to be unparalleled, and since he intended to build the greatest library himself one day, stopping by to take a look wouldn't be a bad idea. Aster bowed slightly and agreed, thanking Alfredo for the opportunity. Alfredo nodded in satisfaction and said that he would fetch the carriage immediately. Carrying Damien like a sack of flour, he walked away, promising that he would return shortly. Aster watched him go, and thought to himself that, although he had strayed a little from his original goal of establishing the library, this turn of events was still a good thing. As he put his clothes back on, he smirked and muttered that it was time to see whether the Blander family's food was any good. Later that night, they finally arrived at the Grand Blander mansion. Alfredo brought the carriage to a stop and turned to the two passengers, announcing respectfully that they had arrived at the Blander estate. As Aster stepped out, he gazed up at the towering mansion and muttered in disbelief that this was his first time visiting it officially. Alfredo bowed deeply and said that it was already quite late, so they should rest comfortably. He called out to one of the maids nearby, instructing her to take care of Damien. The maid, named Lancy, acknowledged the order with a curt nod, but when she turned her gaze toward Damien, her expression became icy. In a cold tone, she told the young master to follow her. Damien scratched his head awkwardly, forcing a nervous smile as he greeted her hesitantly. But before he could say more, Lancy immediately began scolding him harshly, dragging him along. Damien screamed in panic, apologizing profusely and begging for mercy as his voice echoed through the hall. Aster simply watched the scene unfold, speechless at the bizarre dynamic. Meanwhile, Alfredo made his way down a dimly lit corridor, illuminated only by moonlight. He stopped in front of a large door at the end of the hall and knocked gently. A calm female voice from inside instructed him to enter. As Alfredo stepped in, a woman seated behind a grand desk immediately asked, "Damien?" Bowing, Alfredo reported that the young master had been found in the 7th gray zone, and that he had just brought him back. The room fell silent for a brief moment before an explosion of magic erupted right in front of him. Alfredo stood firm, unfazed, as the woman slammed her hand on the desk and shouted in anger. A blast of magic struck the floor beside him, the ground cracking from the impact. She demanded to know if Damien was all right, and if anything had happened to him. Her voice trembled with fury as she pointed her hand at him, a glowing magic circle forming at her fingertips. She shouted that if even a single hair on her son's head had been harmed, she would not forgive it. Alfredo remained calm, and lowered his head respectfully, asking Lady Bianca to please calm down and listen first. After his detailed explanation, Lady Bianca exhaled slowly and returned to her seat. She muttered that it was a relief. Alfredo nodded in agreement, saying that indeed, it was fortunate. Inwardly, however, he thought to himself that it was a relief not only for Lady Bianca but also for whoever might have harmed the young master. The fury of a mother once known as the Blood Witch was something no one could hope to stop. He reflected that it was a good thing that this much was all she had unleashed. Lady Bianca smiled faintly and told him that he had worked hard. Alfredo bowed again, saying there was no need for thanks, it was simply his duty. Then his expression turned serious as he mentioned there was one unusual matter to report. Lady Bianca raised an eyebrow, intrigued, and asked what he meant. Alfredo began to explain that it concerned the friend Damien had made. When she repeated the name Aster and asked what about him, Alfredo replied gravely that the boy had noticed his presence before he had even revealed himself. He explained that when they finally came face to face, Aster already had a mana bullet charged and ready in his hand. Lady Bianca leaned back in surprise, remarking that it was certainly an astonishing talent for a child from the gray zone to possess such ability. Alfredo agreed, and then, with a careful tone, asked if he might make a request. The following morning, Alfredo went to see Aster. Without any delay or hesitation, he went straight to the point and made his offer. He asked Aster to become the family's successor. Aster's eyes widened in shock at the unexpected proposal. Alfredo spread his arms and smiled proudly to himself, convinced that the boy would surely accept. After all, he thought, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance for a stray from the gray zone to gain a high position, wealth, and even honor under a prestigious household's name. But before he could continue his inner triumph, Aster responded flatly, saying one word, no. Alfredo froze on the spot, his confident smile fading. His eyes went wide in disbelief as he stammered, asking if he had heard that correctly. He blinked rapidly, completely thrown off, and repeated in confusion, boy? Am I hearing this right? Aster suddenly muttered under his breath, damn it. Hearing him, Damien popped out from behind and asked curiously what that phrase meant. Without hesitation, Aster grabbed Damien and covered his mouth with his hand, then turned toward Alfredo with a polite but firm expression. He thanked the butler sincerely for the offer, saying that being considered as the successor to the butler master was an honor. However, he added that he preferred things the way they were now and repeated his appreciation once more. Alfredo was visibly surprised by the rejection. He began to ask why Aster would turn down such an opportunity, but stopped mid-sentence as realization struck him. He muttered to himself that it all made sense. Aster had been born a vagrant with nothing, and had learned magic purely through natural talent. Meanwhile, Damien was still struggling in Aster's grip, muffled by the hand pressed against his mouth. He tried to speak through it, insisting that he hadn't said damn it, but that Aster had. Alfredo continued his internal thoughts, observing that Aster's self-assured attitude likely stemmed from his unusual background. He reflected that he understood the feeling himself, as he too had once been born into an ordinary family and had run wild without understanding his own limits. Alfredo's expression then hardened as he spoke out loud in a serious tone. He told Aster that the world was vast. Aster replied casually, acknowledging that it was indeed not small. Annoyed by his dismissive response, Alfredo added that Aster probably felt as if he could do anything and conquer the world at his age. Aster, still unbothered, simply said that he did not feel that way. Rage began to simmer within Alfredo as he muttered under his breath for himself to endure. Forcing himself to remain calm, he then spoke up again and asked Aster if he had ever heard of the saying, a goblin in the canyon. He explained that it referred to someone raised in a narrow, sheltered place who was unaware of the dangers beyond. Before he could continue, Aster interrupted him with a smirk and remarked that he thought of himself more as a wyvern instead. That comment made Alfredo snap. He stomped the ground with such force that his foot buried deep into it, and he raised his voice furiously, shouting that the boy knew nothing. He declared loudly that he, the butler master himself, would personally show Aster just how vast and terrifying the world truly was. A short while later, they arrived at the butler training hall. As Alfredo opened the large wooden doors, the trainees inside immediately stopped their drills and turned their heads toward him. In unison, they stood straight, saluted, and shouted their greetings. Greeting to the butler master. Alfredo turned his head toward Aster and asked what he thought of the scene before him. He explained that all of those trainees were around Aster's age, but were officially recognized talents of House Blando. He added that Aster should be able to sense something from them. Aster observed the group carefully. His eyes swept over the well-trained young butlers whose disciplined movements and subtle mana presence filled the entire space. He acknowledged in his mind that House Blando's standards were impressive. These trainees were still in their teens, yet their training was refined. But as his gaze met theirs, he smirked faintly and thought to himself that despite their talent, their eyes told another story. To him, they still looked like a bunch of goblins. Out loud, Aster admitted that he did feel something. Hearing that, Alfredo became visibly excited. His face flushed with enthusiasm as he asked eagerly if Aster would now accept his proposal. He told him that if he succeeded him as butler master, he would shine even brighter than these trainees. But Aster only shook his head and replied calmly that he hated the light. Alfredo's expression turned strained as he shouted in frustration, asking why Aster would refuse such an opportunity. Before Alfredo could continue, one of the trainees raised his hand and called out for permission to speak. Alfredo turned toward him and identified him as Winston, asking if he had something to say. Winston smirked and remarked that if Aster had truly felt anything, he wouldn't have turned down such an offer. He suggested that perhaps Aster hadn't yet experienced what true magic was, and, with Alfredo's permission, he wanted to give him a taste of it himself. Alfredo narrowed his eyes and muttered quietly that the trainee was arrogant, but his idea wasn't bad. He then turned back to Aster and proposed a duel, asking what he thought about facing that young man. Aster looked around the hall at the trainees who were whispering among themselves. He thought to himself that he already knew how they viewed him. Nothing more than a lucky vagrant who had rolled in from nowhere and caught the butler master's attention. They saw him as a thorn in their side. He then turned back to Alfredo and asked if he could choose his own opponent. Alfredo, curious, told him to go ahead. Aster pointed at Winston, then at another trainee, and then another, until he had chosen 5 in total. After making his selections, he said that he would take on all 5 of them at once. The hall fell into stunned silence. The trainees stared at him in disbelief, while Aster looked back at them with a mocking grin and asked if they were scared. He added coldly that if they were, they might as well go die. Alfredo was momentarily shocked by the audacity of his declaration, but then a wide grin spread across his face. He burst into laughter, delighted by Aster's spirit. In his thoughts, he praised the boy, thinking that this was exactly the kind of fire and pride a successor should possess. Alfredo then raised his voice and asked Aster if he could take responsibility for those words, warning that what he said could be taken as an insult to House Blando. Aster smirked confidently and replied that he would take responsibility. Alfredo nodded firmly and declared that the duel would begin. He gave him 1 minute. If Aster could last that long, he would be rewarded with a gift, but if he failed, Alfredo said he would hold him accountable. Aster narrowed his eyes and thought to himself that by responsible, Alfredo likely meant forcing him to become his successor. The old man was clearly trying to rope him in. Nevertheless, he accepted and agreed to the match. Moments later, Aster and the 5 chosen trainees stood in the center of the training hall. On the sidelines, one of the instructors whispered nervously to Alfredo that the setup seemed dangerous. Alfredo only smiled and replied that was exactly why it was valuable. Aster's stubbornness needed to be broken if he was ever to grow. The instructor was shocked by that reasoning. Inwardly, he panicked, realizing that if Aster got seriously injured, his career as an instructor would be finished. He turned toward the side, where Damien and the maid Lancy were watching. Leaning closer, the instructor whispered urgently to Damien that his friend was in real danger and begged him to stop the butler master. Damien, however, looked more impressed than concerned. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he exclaimed that he was shocked too. The instructor groaned and buried his face in his palm, muttering hopelessly under his breath. Beside them, Lancy warned Damien not to interfere, reminding him that Lady Bianca would scold him if he got involved. Damien pouted and muttered quietly, "Damn it." At that moment, Alfredo shouted at the instructor to start the match. The man, on the verge of tears, reluctantly answered that he understood. Behind him, Lancy began scolding Damien for using such vulgar language. The instructor sighed heavily, muttering to himself that orders were orders and that he had done his best. As the fight was about to begin, Lancy told Damien that she would be back soon and ordered him not to get involved. Damien grinned mischievously and agreed. Standing at the center, the instructor began to explain the duel's rules, stating that it would be turn-based. But Alfredo interrupted him sharply, declaring that it should be a free-for-all instead. The instructor sighed, muttering to himself that it didn't matter anyway, and then announced the final rules. It would be a free-for-all match continuing until one side surrendered, though he retained the right to stop it at any time. Across the hall, Winston clenched his teeth as he glared at Aster. In his mind, he seethed with resentment, thinking that the vagrant boy had no idea of his place. He vowed to crush him and expose his true worth in front of everyone. The instructor raised his hand and shouted for the duel to begin. The instant the signal was given, Aster launched his attack without hesitation. Winston was hit square in the stomach by a blast of magic, doubling over and gasping for breath. When he turned around in pain, he saw that all the other trainees had already been struck as well. 2 of them were lying on the ground clutching their stomachs, while the remaining 2 were crouched down groaning in agony. Aster began walking toward them slowly, his footsteps echoing through the silent hall. Winston flinched at the sound, his body trembling. Aster grinned as he spoke, saying that it seemed best for him to give them the experience himself. 5 glowing orbs of mana began forming in his hand, pulsing with energy. He told them his first lesson: never underestimate the little guy. Winston's eyes widened in disbelief as he muttered to himself that Aster was using magic bullets, a basic mana control spell that consumed too much mana to be effective in real combat. Aster continued, saying that the second lesson was never to judge others too easily. He hurled the 5 glowing bullets at the trainees, each one striking their heads with perfect precision. He then spoke again, giving them the third lesson. The world was vast and bitter. In a blink, Aster appeared directly in front of Winston and drove his fist into his face, sending him flying backward. As Winston landed, Aster told him that from now on, he would inject all these experiences into him, so he should learn them well. Clutching his face, Winston screamed in frustration and pain, tears streaming from his eyes as he shouted that what Aster was doing wasn't magic. Aster prepared another attack, raising his leg. He replied coldly that it was magic. Then, with a powerful motion, he kicked Winston straight in the face, sending him crashing backward again as he added, "Physical magic." The instructor and the other trainees stood frozen in shock as they watched Aster completely overpowering the butler trainees. Even Alfredo, observing from the sidelines, was taken aback by the display before him. In his mind, he analyzed what he had just witnessed. That was a magic bullet. But how many times had it been compressed? Judging by its power, it had to be at least 4 or 5 times. He thought to himself that if it had landed properly back then, the damage would have been devastating. Without noticing, Damien had already rushed into the center of the hall, his eyes shining with excitement as he healed the beaten trainees while Aster continued to land blows around him. Alfredo kept thinking in disbelief that Aster's innate mana control was exceptional, but what stunned him even more was how naturally the boy fought. How was he so good at beating people up? Just then, a loud voice echoed through the hall, snapping Alfredo out of his thoughts. Someone had called his name. He turned quickly, and froze when he saw Damien's mother entering with Lancy at her side. Startled, he stammered her name. Lady Bianca? On the sidelines, the instructor noticed her arrival and muttered in relief that Lady Bianca was there and that Lancy had come to save them. As Alfredo approached, Bianca's voice was sharp and controlled as she asked what had happened there. Bowing respectfully, Alfredo hesitated before explaining that he had merely wanted to run a simple test. "A test?" Bianca repeated, her tone rising as she glanced around the training hall, now filled with groaning, battered trainees. "You call this a test?" Her gaze shifted toward the center, where Damien was still healing the wounded students. She called out to him and issued immediate orders. She instructed Alfredo to gather the trainees and have them withdraw, then told both Damien and Aster to return to their rooms. After that, she turned to the instructor and called his name. The instructor responded nervously, admitting that he had done his best but could not control the situation. Before he could finish his sentence, Bianca interrupted him curtly and told him he was fired. Later that evening, Bianca sat across from Alfredo in her study. Her tone was calm, but edged with disapproval as she addressed him. She said that she understood his intentions but made it clear that this time he had gone too far. Lowering his head in remorse, Alfredo apologized sincerely, admitting that he had lost his temper and was prepared to accept any punishment she deemed fit. Bianca placed her teacup down and inquired about what had happened during the sparring match. She asked if Damien had helped Aster. Alfredo shook his head and said that Damien had not intervened. After a brief pause, he added in amazement that Aster had been incredibly skilled at hitting people. Realizing his own words sounded strange, he cleared his throat and apologized before elaborating that Aster had used the same magic bullet technique as before during the sparring session, but this time, it had been compressed 4 or 5 times more, greatly amplifying its power. Bianca processed this information carefully. That meant, she said, that Aster possessed remarkable mana control. She murmured thoughtfully to herself that although she had not witnessed it, the scene must have been quite a spectacle. Defeating 5 trained butlers single-handedly was no small feat, especially by relying on a single magic bullet. She noted that manipulating pure mana was extremely difficult even for high-level mages. After a moment, she asked aloud about Alfredo's earlier proposal to make Aster his successor. Alfredo replied that Aster had firmly rejected it. Bianca nodded slowly, saying she understood, then lifted her cup again and took a thoughtful sip. She silently concluded that she would need to reassess Aster and reevaluate her opinion of him. After a pause, she instructed Alfredo to bring Aster to her. Some time later, Aster arrived at Bianca's room. She sat gracefully at a table, smiling warmly while Damien sat beside her enjoying some snacks. Bianca greeted him kindly and invited him to take a seat. As Aster sat down, He said he had heard that she wished to speak with him. She confirmed this, then reached into a drawer and placed a small ornate container on the table in front of him. Aster looked at it curiously and asked what it was. Bianca explained that she had heard Alfredo promised him a gift. Aster muttered quietly to himself, recalling the butler's earlier words. If you can hold out for just 1 minute, I'll give you a gift. He had not expected the promise to be fulfilled so soon, much less personally prepared by Lady Bianca. Bianca smiled and encouraged him to open it. Aster carefully lifted the lid and a soft golden glow spilled out from within. His eyes widened as he realized what it was, a high-grade magical item. He thought to himself that even in House Blandor, only recruits who reached the top 5 divisions of the Mage Corps received such a reward. His expression shifted subtly as he pondered her intentions. In his experience, genuine goodwill usually ended with a meal. When gifts were involved, there was often another motive hidden behind them. Even if it was meant as a wager reward, a mid-grade gift would have been understandable, but a high-grade one, that suggested something more. Bianca, noticing his hesitation, reassured him with a gentle tone. She told him he could accept it without any worry. The gift was also meant as an apology for the events earlier that day and a token of gratitude for helping Damien in the gray zone. Still cautious, Aster asked if accepting it meant he would have to join House Blandor. Bianca smiled faintly and said no. He then asked if there was poison in it, to which she replied with a sigh that there was not. Finally, he questioned if there were truly no conditions attached, and Bianca firmly confirmed that there were none at all. Satisfied, Aster closed the container and thanked her politely. Bianca responded that it was nothing. Aster grinned, his eyes gleaming with delight as he thought that this was an unexpected gain. After a pause, Bianca said there was something else she wanted to propose to him. Inwardly, Aster smirked and thought to himself that he knew there was more. Bianca then told him she would arrange for his admission into the academy, and asked if he would attend together with Damien. Surprised, Aster repeated the word academy. Bianca explained that Damien had originally been meant to enroll the previous year, but he had strongly opposed it, which led to it being postponed. She had not expected him to run away this year either. That was why she was asking Aster to accompany him. Damien liked him and might agree to attend if Aster went along. Damien nodded eagerly beside her, exclaiming that he would be fine with it if his friend went too. Aster considered it carefully. From Bianca's perspective, it was clearly important. She feared that if she forced Damien to enroll, he might run away again, and there was no clear way to change his mind. For Aster, though, the offer had its advantages. Attending the academy was a good opportunity. In a world driven by bloodlines and influence, education was a valuable credential that could open doors. Still, part of him hesitated. It felt as though he might be putting himself on a leash. After some thought, he lowered his head slightly and said that he would think about it for now. Bianca accepted his answer and told him to let her know once he made his decision. Then, with a curious tone, she asked why he had rejected Alfredo's proposal to become his successor. Aster glanced briefly toward the back of the room and noticed movement behind the door. Smirking, he replied casually that his knees were precious. Bianca blinked, confused by his response, and asked what he meant. Outside the door, Alfredo, who had been secretly eavesdropping, froze in disbelief. His eyes widened as he muttered under his breath, "Boy?" Later, as the first light of dawn began to rise, Aster sat cross-legged in meditation, having stayed awake through the night to absorb the energy of a high-grade item. His breathing was steady, his focus unbroken. As the mana circulated through him, he felt the immense flow of power and thought to himself that this was indeed something belonging to the realm of a top-grade product. Even with only 10% absorption, his mana had already increased significantly. Perhaps, he mused, it was due to his physique having changed into that of a flameborn. Opening his eyes, Aster raised his hands before him. Threads of magic gathered and shimmered around his palms. He observed quietly, realizing that normally, the absorption of spirit power resulted in loss and impurity, but this time, there was none of that. He noted to himself that the result was even more effective than he had anticipated. Turning his gaze toward the window, he murmured softly, "Anyway, the academy, huh?" His mind drifted. He had thought about it before, and he knew that his decision was already made. If he enrolled in the academy, finding a sponsor would become far easier, and the advantages were considerable. Yet still, something about it felt uncertain. "It feels like I might be walking right into a trap," he whispered to himself before stretching his arms. After a pause, he said quietly, "Maybe I should go for a run around the place." Rising from his seat, Aster opened the door to step outside. Just as he closed it behind him, a voice came from beside the entrance. "Are you the guy?" called Aster. He turned toward the sound and found a young man leaning casually against the wall. Aster narrowed his eyes, studying him carefully. The man had platinum blonde hair, an unmistakable trait of a particular bloodline. Aster thought silently that since the direct line only included Damien, this person must be a collateral relative. He sighed inwardly, wondering why that family always seemed to bring trouble. Without hesitation, he replied bluntly, "Nope." The man stammered in surprise. What? No? he exclaimed, staring in disbelief. He squinted as he examined Aster more closely. Dingy gray hair, that faintly irritating look in your eyes, everything matches you perfectly. Aster frowned and thought to himself, look at this guy. Pointing toward his own hair, he said aloud with mock innocence, hair color can change a lot depending on the light. Then, putting on an exaggerated expression, he added, and these eyes, how could anyone call them irritating? The man studied him more intently for several moments. Then, with a thoughtful hum, he turned away. They look kind actually. Sorry for the misunderstanding, I'll be on my way, he said, walking off with an air of satisfaction. Before Aster could react, Alfredo suddenly appeared, hurrying toward him. Dropping to his knees, the old butler shouted, young man? No, Aster! I came to clear up my misunderstanding. His voice carried through the hall as he continued frantically. I couldn't tell you last night, so I lost sleep over it. Even if you become a butler, you don't need to wear out your knees that much. It was all a misunderstanding. Aster froze where he stood. His expression turned to stone as he slowly looked down at Alfredo, then turned his head toward the platinum-haired man. The man's eyes widened in shock as Alfredo's words echoed in the corridor. Aster clenched his lips tightly and muttered, damn it. The blond man's eyes lit up with triumph as he shouted, that look in your eyes, I was right. Eyes as unpleasant as dead goblin eyes aren't common. Aster scoffed and admitted curtly, yeah, you got me. Look at this, the man shouted angrily, pointing at him. Lying to me and still acting all brazen? He stopped abruptly when he noticed Alfredo glaring coldly in his direction. The man hesitated, then turned away sharply. I'll let you off for now, he muttered, but come to the mage hall later. I'll fix that attitude of yours. Sure, whatever you say, Aster replied flatly. As the man walked away, Alfredo glanced toward Aster and asked with concern, is something wrong? Aster smiled faintly and answered, nothing serious. Watching the man disappear around the corner, he sighed, thinking that he had not been in the best mood anyway. The timing, he mused, was perfect. He thought quietly, I'll see you later. Then, turning to Alfredo, he said, head butler, could I meet with the madam right now? Later, Aster arrived at Lady Bianca's chamber. The woman sat at her desk, busy writing on a stack of papers. Without looking up, she greeted him calmly. Welcome, Aster. To request a meeting so early in the morning. Don't tell me you've already made up your mind. Yes, madam, Aster replied. I'll enroll in the academy. Lady Bianca paused her writing and looked up in surprise. After a moment, she smiled faintly and said, I'm surprised you decided so quickly. Good, we should prepare as soon as possible. In the meantime, please make yourself comfortable. Aster bowed slightly. Thank you for your consideration. After he left the room, a short while later, Alfredo peeked through the doorway and stepped inside. Madam, the boy, he began. He accepted. Thankfully, Lady Bianca answered before he could finish. Alfredo's eyes lit up with excitement. As expected, that's our boy, he shouted. His passion, the flames in his eyes, I knew it. He pointed dramatically forward and continued. The first semester will be fine, we'll cover it. But what about the next semester? For a vagrant from the gray zone, that tuition will be hard to get. He'll get anxious. Why? Because he'll want to learn more. And then, a helping hand will appear. The sponsorship of Alfredo. Lady Bianca sighed. Alfredo, you're too loud. My apologies, madam, I got carried away, he said quickly. Since it's nearly mealtime, I'll head to the kitchen. As soon as he left, Lady Bianca set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, releasing a deep sigh. In her thoughts, she understood why Alfredo was so elated. After having his offers rejected so many times, he finally had a chance. Still, she admitted silently that this academy proposal was a rather careless plan. The reason Alfredo's confidence seemed so unshakable, she thought, was probably because he himself had once been tricked the same way by the previous head butler. Shaking her head, she murmured softly, Alfredo, poor guy. Elsewhere, Aster walked through the grounds until he came to a stop. Before him stood an elegant castle-like building. He gazed up at it and thought to himself, this is the Mage Hall, where that jerk from earlier was. After a moment of hesitation, he entered. Inside, the air smelled faintly of parchment and candle wax. A hooded man with a small candle head approached and asked, what brings you here? Aster stammered slightly. He began, realizing too late that he didn't even know the man's name. After a short pause, he explained his reason for coming, describing the man he had met earlier. The hooded figure nodded and pointed down a corridor. I was expecting you. Please, this way. They walked in silence until the guide stopped before a door. Go right in here, he said. Oh, and after you open the door, mind your head. Aster pushed the door open, and immediately a stack of papers flew out, striking him on the head. He coughed through the dust and thought dryly, so this is what he meant by that. A calm voice then called out from inside the room. Are you Aster? A man dressed in white stepped forward, holding a candle in his hand. He smiled warmly and introduced himself. Nice to meet you. I'm Wenji von Blando. You came to see my little brother. Aster froze. What? Brother? he repeated, his expression blank with disbelief. Then, muttering under his breath, he said, "That punk called his brother?" As Aster sat down with Wenji von Blando, a series of thoughts passed through his mind. During his years infiltrating various magic academies as a troubleshooter, he had learned to recognize certain traits shared by mages who devoted their lives to study. Among them, there was one peculiar pattern he often noticed in those known collectively as penholders. Their appearance, particularly their hair, revealed much about their state of mind. Many of them had disheveled hair, often thinned or uneven because they habitually pulled at it while working. Aster mentally divided these mages into 4 distinct stages. The first stage was denial. They refused to acknowledge that their hair was falling out and wore their robes pulled over their heads to hide it. The second stage came when they gave up pretending and simply revealed their condition. The third stage involved complete acceptance. They shaved their heads entirely. The final stage, the fourth, was when they grew desperate enough to attempt research into magic that could make hair grow again. No one had ever succeeded in that pursuit, yet Aster thought to himself that Wenji von Blando seemed somehow different from all those he had seen before. As Wenji poured tea into a cup, he began to speak in a composed tone, first offering an apology. He explained that he had initially wondered whether Aster's behavior stemmed from his position as a younger sibling, and he admitted that he had assumed no guest of the young master would commit a rude mistake. Aster, quietly observing him, was impressed. He thought to himself that Wenji was remarkable, composed, polite, and strikingly young for someone of his apparent standing. Aster asked if Wenji worked at a magic academy, to which Wenji replied that he indeed did and was currently serving as the vice dean. He politely invited Aster to drink his tea. As Aster took a sip, he reflected that it was unusual for someone so young to hold such a high position. A prestigious family like the Blandos would not have placed a relative in that role simply because of bloodline, so Wenji must have possessed the ability to earn it. Wenji then remarked that Aster was quite an unusual person, different from the typical wayward sons of noble families. Aster laughed awkwardly, acknowledging the comment, but inwardly he found the situation frustrating. It would have been easier if Wenji had been openly hostile. Instead, he greeted Aster with a kind smile, which made him far more difficult to read. Aster decided that, personality-wise, they were incompatible. Changing the topic, Wenji mentioned that he had heard Aster had been recommended to enter Zenion Academy and congratulated him. Aster responded modestly, confirming it was true. Wenji continued, saying that Zenion Academy would provide him with countless opportunities to learn. He revealed that he himself was a graduate of Zenion, having been part of the 145th class. Aster paused, realizing that Wenji was attempting to create an academic bond from nowhere. Wenji quickly scratched his head and laughed, apologizing for getting carried away. He suggested that they move to the main point of their meeting. When Aster echoed the words main point, Wenji set down his cup, and his tone shifted. He explained that before they proceeded, he wished to confirm something. He asked Aster if he would be willing to risk his life for a friend. The sudden question caught Aster off guard. Wenji then pulled a book from his magic pocket, explaining that the matter concerned the fate of the Blando family. He stated that if Aster was truly willing to risk his life, he would give him the book. Aster's eyes widened in shock as Wenji placed the book on the table in front of him. He recognized it immediately. It was the Blando family's core secret technique, the Light of Healing Grimoire. Meanwhile, outside in the Blando family's garden, Lady Bianca was tending to her flowers. After trimming a few blossoms, she paused, exhaled deeply, and gazed up at the sky. She reflected that Damien's admission to the academy, which had caused considerable trouble, had finally been resolved. It was one less worry on her mind. She thought of Aster, considering him a truly good friend, talented, confident, and according to Alfredo, occasionally a bit rude or bold. Yet at his age, such behavior was natural. What Bianca admired most about Aster was his attitude toward Damien. Even after learning about Damien's background, Aster had treated him with unwavering sincerity, showing no trace of flattery. Bianca considered him of a different caliber from most, someone worth keeping close. However, that same quality made him difficult to tie down. He was, in her eyes, like a free bird. There were many ways to keep such a person by one's side, but she knew she would have to think carefully about which method to use. She could not afford to lose such valuable talent, not for Damien's sake. Back in the Mage Hall, Aster continued staring at the grimoire, his thoughts racing. He questioned what Wenji's true intentions were in offering such a powerful family secret. When he looked up, Wenji's clear, pure eyes caught his attention. Aster thought that perhaps that was why he could not read him. Usually, emotions, whether good or evil, showed faintly in a person's eyes, but Wenji's gaze revealed nothing. It was as unreadable as that of an assassin. Aster concluded that Wenji was wearing a mask so complete that even he might no longer know his true self. His thoughts were interrupted when Wenji spoke again. He warned Aster not to answer hastily or be swayed by the promise of a reward. Aster scoffed, declaring that he already had an answer. Thinking to himself that now that he understood the situation, his unease had disappeared, he looked up and responded confidently that he refused. Wenji appeared visibly shocked by the response. Aster crossed his legs and thought that there was no need for either of them to feel uneasy. They were both standing in the same muddy waters. Speaking aloud, he told Wenji that if he had a request, he should simply state it. If Aster found it reasonable, he would do it. If not, he would decline. Wenji's expression changed. His calm demeanor hardened into something far more menacing. He warned that merely hearing the request could endanger Aster's life, and if Aster refused afterward, he might have to kill him. Aster glared back with equal intensity, his tone defiant as he told Wenji to go ahead and kill him, adding that one only dies once, not twice. Then, half to himself, he muttered that in his case, he might actually die twice. Suddenly, the papers in the room began to rise, fluttering violently as magic energy surged around Wenji. The objects nearby shook, yet Aster remained perfectly calm. After several tense moments, Wenji's fierce expression broke into a grin. He scoffed and admitted defeat, declaring that Aster had passed his test. Wenji explained that he would now speak openly. He confessed that he needed someone trustworthy but could not rely on anyone within the Blando family. Aster thought to himself that he had almost lost control, and struck first, realizing just how intense the moment had been. Wenji continued, admitting that he had not expected much from the encounter. He explained that most gray zone vagabonds were alike, and he had assumed the young master's judgment of character might not yet be refined. However, he reasoned that since the doting madam, who loved the young master deeply, had chosen to keep Aster by Damien's side, there had to be something special about him. Just as Wenji was about to elaborate, Aster cut him off, pointing out that it seemed like the younger brother and the guest had picked a fight. Wenji, clearly irritated, told Aster to either speak casually or formally and choose one. Aster agreed, saying they would do that from now on. Wenji cleared his throat and explained that the argument with his younger brother had provided the perfect excuse to meet Aster. It was natural to call in the person his brother had quarreled with for a private conversation. Aster thought to himself that Wenji's reasoning sounded plausible, though he found it strange that a vice head of a magic academy would need such a pretext. Wenji, noticing Aster's expression, confirmed that his suspicion was correct. He admitted that it had been difficult for him to approach Aster directly. He also clarified that it was not an internal power struggle. The Blando family remained united. Then his tone darkened as he revealed that he was under surveillance by the Declan family. Aster narrowed his eyes and repeated the name, asking why. Wenji said that since Aster had claimed not to fear death, he would be frank, though he assured him he had no intention of killing him. He explained that he was currently researching the heaven source art of the Declan family and believed that they had discovered his efforts. Aster's eyes widened again, shocked by what he was hearing. Wenji continued, asking if Aster knew about the heaven source art, explaining that it was a secret technique that only those of Declan blood could learn. He revealed that he had obtained it by chance. Aster raised his hand to interrupt, asking how someone who should have died long ago could still be alive. He reasoned that if Wenji had researched it from the Blando side, he must also have studied ways to counter it. Wenji commended his sharpness, agreeing that the Declan family was dangerously reckless. He explained that if his research had focused solely on creating a countermeasure, they would have already killed him, even in his position as vice head. He admitted that his initial goal had been to study a countermeasure, but during his research, something unexpected had become visible to him. The very root of all Declan's secret techniques, the foundation of the heaven source art itself. He had even discovered a way to refine it into an art more perfect than the original. As he spoke, Wenji's expression twisted, and he clutched his chest with trembling hands. His voice wavered as he confessed that he could not stop himself from pursuing it further. He looked at Aster with a wild gleam in his eyes and asked if Aster could understand his feelings. Aster stared at him, realization dawning in his mind. This man, he thought, was not merely eccentric or ambitious, he was utterly insane. Aster remained silent, still processing everything he had heard. Inwardly, he thought that Wenji was far from being an ordinary lunatic. The man seemed genuinely obsessed with his research, even if it meant bringing chaos to his own family. Then, as Aster pieced things together, a realization struck him. The timing lined up perfectly. In his previous life, when the Declan family had annihilated the Blando family, the incident had revolved entirely around Wenji's research on the heaven source art, the creation of the so-called new heaven source art. Farine, that ruthless man, had staked the very fate of the Declan family on destroying the Blando family because of it. From the very beginning, Farine had seen potential in Wenji's work. It also explained why he had been so absurdly powerful. Aster's thoughts were interrupted when Wenji suddenly called his name, asking if he perhaps regretted getting involved. Wenji mentioned that the research did require a bit of scale. Aster dismissed the comment and asked directly why Wenji had sought him out. Wenji explained that he had not reported his research on the heaven source art to his family. He suspected that someone within the Blando family had planted a spy to monitor him, but he had been unable to find out who it was. Aster suggested that if the secret research had been leaked, there must be someone he suspected, perhaps a secretary. Wenji shook his head and said that it was unlikely. The problem, he explained, was more related to the acquisition route of the Heaven's source art itself. Aster then deduced that if the route of acquisition had been traced, the Declan family must have deliberately leaked the security formula to bait him out. Wenji gave a small laugh and admitted that Aster was exactly right. He said that the moment he realized his tail had been stepped on, he released part of the formula as a countermeasure. He confessed that he did not want to die either. Aster responded coldly that it might be easier for Wenji to simply die with the Declan family since they would probably welcome him. Wenji only smiled faintly and said that he had his own personal reasons for not doing so. Then, lifting his left hand, Wenji explained his real request. Since Aster was not directly tied to any noble family, he wanted him to handle a matter in secret. At his gesture, papers from the back of the room flew toward his hand. He told Aster that the research was part of a joint project, but his portion had been progressing poorly. He promised to reward Aster properly if he delivered a particular thesis to Professor Faroon at Zenian Academy. If Aster did that, Wenji said he would give him the light of healing technique. Aster paused, then grinned slightly to himself. He thought this might be the perfect opportunity. Leaning forward, he accepted the offer but added his own terms. He said that he would take the light of healing technique at his own risk, but he also wanted the completed version of the New Heaven's source art later. That, he explained, was the only way they could truly become comrades sailing on the same ship. Inwardly, Aster decided to double down on his gamble. Wenji looked at him silently for a moment, then remarked that Aster was quite shameless. Aster only smirked and told him to simply say yes or no, since if Wenji refused, he would not take the deal at all. After a short silence, Wenji placed his hand on his forehead and sighed. He said he would agree. The New Heaven's source art, as he called it, was still incomplete, and the name itself did not matter. He pointed out that since Aster had never learned the original Heaven's source art, the new one would be useless to him for now. Still, he promised to give him the completed version later. However, Wenji added a condition of his own. Extending the thesis papers toward Aster, he said that until the research was complete, he might require Aster's assistance from time to time. He hoped Aster would lend him a hand when the time came, since comrades on the same ship should at least do that much. Aster agreed easily, saying that if it concerned the thesis, he would help. With a grin, he took the papers from Wenji's hand. Then, with a completely straight face, he said he could not read. The room fell silent. After a moment, Aster yanked the papers out of Wenji's hand with a grin and admitted that he was only joking. Wenji's expression darkened as he muttered that Aster was not only shameless but also not funny. As Aster tucked the thesis papers into his pocket, he asked whether Professor Faroon could be trusted. Wenji explained that from their academy days up to Faroon's appointment as an assistant professor, the two had competed fiercely for first and second place. Unfortunately, Wenji said, their rivalry had ended when he returned to serve the Blando family. Aster's expression turned thoughtful. He could almost hear Wenji thinking to himself that he had been the superior one. The thought made Aster sigh internally. Professor Faroon, he mused, might just be another lunatic like Wenji. The world truly was coming to an end if there was more than one mad genius at Zenian Academy. Later that night, in his room, Aster emptied a pouch upside down onto his desk. A pile of books and a sealed letter spilled out. He frowned, wondering aloud why Wenji had stuffed so much into a subspace pouch just to avoid detection. Then he noticed the letter and opened it. It began with, "To my dear friend Aster." Aster's expression flattened immediately. "Dear," he muttered sarcastically to himself. The letter continued, stating that Wenji had selected essential grimoires for Aster to master in the future. It included a suggested learning order and encouraged him to study diligently to cultivate intellect befitting his stature. It was signed, "Your friend, Wenji von Blando." Aster glanced at the stack of grimoires and admitted that it was quite an impressive gift. He organized them neatly on the table and sat down, studying them in silence. The way Wenji had arranged a step-by-step curriculum from basic to advanced magic showed that he truly was a genius, though still a lunatic. A small smile tugged at Aster's lips as he murmured that it was perfect. He then pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. List of book sponsors, Wenji von Blando. As he examined the books, he estimated there were about 132 volumes in total, not counting the Light of Healing Grimoire and the New Heaven's Source Art thesis. He planned to discuss placing the Light of Healing Grimoire in the Magic Tower with Damien later. That, he decided, could count as a friend privilege. Those 132 books, he thought, were not just a random collection. They formed a single cohesive category. If properly arranged, they could serve as the foundation for anyone wishing to study magic. He realized that the tower would no longer simply be a storage for books, it would become something far greater. It would be a place of learning, a sanctuary for knowledge seekers. That, he decided, would be the true identity of the tower. Meanwhile, at the magic hall, Wenji stood by the window, gazing at the night sky. He reflected on the day's events and thought that his encounter with Aster had been an unexpected harvest. He admitted to himself that if Aster had turned out to be only moderately useful, he would have simply sent him to deliver the thesis and discarded him afterward. But Aster was different. He was interesting. A grin spread across Wenji's face as he recalled their conversation. He remembered Aster's bold words, "Go ahead and kill me. You only die once, not twice." Wenji burst out laughing, his voice echoing through the hall. He had only meant those words as a threat to test Aster's resolve, but the young man had met them without fear. Wenji admitted to himself that he had no real reason not to kill him, yet Aster's calm eyes had stopped him. Those eyes had held no trace of fear. He truly did not care whether he lived or died. That, Wenji thought, made him different from all the others. Fascinatingly different. He concluded that although Aster was clearly hiding something, that was not necessarily a bad thing. For the first time, Wenji felt as though he had found someone who could stand beside him and look in the same direction. It was a strange but exciting feeling. Still, one question lingered in his mind. Did Aster really not know how to read? He dismissed the thought with a laugh, deciding that it was impossible. Time passed and morning came. In Aster's room, he dressed neatly in front of a mirror, wearing refined clothes suitable for his new journey. From outside, a voice called to him, announcing that it was time to depart. A few moments later, Lancy stood by the carriage holding Aster's luggage. As they walked toward it, she informed him that once he arrived at Zenian Academy, he would only have to complete a few simple documents. She added that both he and the young lord were exempt from the entrance exam. Turning to look at him, she smiled warmly and remarked that he looked every bit a proper academy student now. It suited him. Aster thanked her, and she gestured for him to get in, saying they should go. As he looked up at the sky, he thought that being exempt from the entrance exam was typical of prestigious families. It was more of a special admission than anything else. Still, he admitted to himself that he did not mind being exempt either. Just then, Damien called out to him excitedly, urging his friend to hurry up. As Aster and Damien approached the carriage, Lady Bianca, who had been standing nearby, spoke gently. She told Damien to take care of himself before turning to Aster. With a kind smile, she said that it was a great opportunity and sincerely hoped he would achieve the results he desired. Aster returned her smile and thanked her before stepping into the carriage. As it began to move, he leaned back in his seat, his eyes glinting with determination. The results he wanted, he thought, were already clear in his mind. Zenian Academy, the greatest academy on the eastern continent, awaited him. Countless sponsors and opportunities would be there, and he intended to seize every single one of them. A grin crossed his face as he thought to himself. Just wait, suckers. Classmates. I'm coming. As the carriage journeyed on, Aster rested a hand on the book in his lap, his mind occupied with its contents. He reflected on Wenji's undeniable brilliance as a magus, contemplating how the basic principles of magic were simple, yet their interpretations were endless. He considered the element of water as an example. To some, it represented the water of life, while to others, it was the water of disaster, like a flood. This fundamental difference in perspective, he realized, was why even noble families sharing the same core principles had developed their arts in uniquely different directions. Having now read through all the magic tomes from the subspace, he could clearly perceive the connection between Wenji's curriculum and the Declan family's Heaven's source art. His introspection was severed by Damien's exuberant shout, pointing out that they had arrived at Zenian Academy. Aster leaned to peer out the window, quietly observing the famed institution for the first time. From her seat, Lancy informed them that the carriage could go no further. She explained that, in accordance with the teachings of the first dean, the great sage, every student was required to walk the remaining distance to the entrance ceremony, a rule that applied to all regardless of status. She then bid them farewell, expressing her hope that they would have a good ceremony and receive fine teachings. After they disembarked and the carriage departed, Damien waved enthusiastically before suddenly grabbing Aster's arm. He insisted they hurry, explaining that Lancy had warned them that being late for the entrance ceremony could mean there would be no seats left. As Damien pulled him along, Aster felt a surge of internal surprise. He thought the idea was ridiculous, as an entrance ceremony was not some local theater operating on a first-come, first-served basis. He quickly deduced that Lancy had fabricated this story as a tactical groundwork to prevent Damien from dawdling. He resolved to let it slide this once, acknowledging her blunt but not shameless nature, and firmly telling himself that his compliance was absolutely not because he found this arrangement more convenient. Upon their arrival at the ceremony hall, Damien was overflowing with joy and excitement at the sight of the massive crowd. He looked around with wide-eyed wonder, a bit of drool at the corner of his mouth, and voiced his belief that Lancy had been right about the seating. Aster sighed beside him, fixing his hair and muttering a correction to himself. He then pulled a slip of paper from his pocket and read their assigned seating aloud. Damien, his body trembling with a nervous energy, pleaded that they just sit in some nearby empty seats, repeating his fear that they would be left with none. Aster told him to wait, inwardly exasperated that the boy who had been so reluctant to attend the academy was now behaving with such fervent excitement. The situation escalated when Damien, not looking where he was going, bumped into a large student and fell to the ground. The large young man stared down and demanded to know what his problem was. Aster immediately moved to help Damien to his feet, asking if he was all right. Damien laughed it off, claiming he was not hurt. As they attempted to walk away, Damien waved and called out an apology for his clumsiness. They were halted by the student's sharp command. He pointed to the edge of his sleeve and demanded to know what had been smeared on it. Aster looked and identified the substance as drool, internally noting the student's appearance marked him as a scion of a noble family. He watched, anticipating Damien's likely response. True to form, Damien immediately seized the student's hand and began wiping the drool off with his own fingers and mouth, apologizing profusely and exclaiming that he was making it shinier. Aster observed the noble's face contort with visible boiling rage and concluded that a physical confrontation was now inevitable. The prediction proved correct as the student suddenly lunged forward, throwing a punch at Damien while yelling a derogatory insult. However, Aster intercepted the blow, blocking the punch and addressing the aggressor as a fellow student. He suggested that the young man was making a mistake and proposed they end the conflict there. The enraged student shoved Aster's hand away and demanded to know his identity. As Aster began to answer, Damien interjected loudly, identifying Aster as his friend. Aster confirmed this with a flat tone. The noble sneered that it was rare to find someone willing to take a beating for a friend, but coldly promised that Aster would regret his choice that day. Aster sighed inwardly, resigning himself to the fact that peaceful coexistence with his peers from the first day was apparently too much to hope for. Out loud, he asked if the student was truly refusing to resolve the matter verbally. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of surrounding students. They began to chatter, identifying the large aggressor as being from the Dolampe family bloodline and speculating on the outcome of a fight. One student then raised his voice, chastising the others for their passive observation and ordering them to spread out and create a ring. He pointed out that the gray-haired boy was a mage and commanded others to erect a force field around the impending duel. The students quickly complied, forming a magical barrier, and soon began placing bets with their meal tickets, some cheering for the Dolampe scion while others favored the underdog. At the back of the crowd, one student observed the unfolding scene with a quiet grin. In the center of the makeshift arena, the Dolampe scion introduced himself as Hickster, the proud second son of his family, and demanded to know Aster's name. Aster responded casually as he loosened his tie, stating that he lacked a distinguished bloodline and could be considered merely a passerby. Hickster scoffed at this, noting his common status but declaring it irrelevant. He proclaimed that, since Aster was a mage, the confined space would be a disadvantage and so he would graciously grant him the first move. Aster paused for a moment, a slow grin spreading across his face as he muttered to himself about the other boy being a riot. He then knocked his tie from his neck and, with a wide, challenging grin, retorted that the one who claimed not to want to talk seemed to have the longest tongue, and asked if he was scared. Hickster's body trembled with pure fury upon hearing this. He roared a curse and charged forward, swinging his right fist in a powerful arc. Aster stood perfectly calm, effortlessly dodging the attack, and stated he had one more thing to say. As he began to prepare his own counterattack, he clarified that the number of opponents was not one guy but two. Hickster braced himself confidently when he saw Aster preparing to attack. He thought arrogantly that he could easily endure a punch from a mere magic student. However, the instant Aster's fist connected with his face, blood sprayed from Hickster's mouth as his body staggered backward from the sheer force. Shock flooded his expression as disbelief filled his thoughts. What kind of punch is this heavy? He wondered in horror. This bastard, is he really a mage? Before he could recover, a faint glow formed on the bruise around his mouth. A magic circle appeared there, causing him to pause and mutter in confusion. Healing magic? His gaze shifted sideways and caught Damien happily casting healing spells nearby. But why? He whispered to himself, unable to comprehend the situation. The nearby students began murmuring among themselves, impressed by what they were seeing. Wow, I guess a prestigious family really is prestigious, huh? One of them remarked, clearly referring to Hickster's lineage. Aster didn't give Hickster time to think. He lunged forward again, forcing Hickster to block awkwardly with his forearm. You even have the luxury to be distracted, Aster remarked coolly, before launching another relentless series of blows. His fists came at Hickster with blinding speed, leaving him barely able to defend himself. Each punch was heavier than the last, forcing Hickster into a purely defensive stance. Aster grinned in amusement as he struck, taunting, "Whoa, you're pretty tough." Meanwhile, Hickster's thoughts were spinning out of control. One of them pummels me, and the other one heals me. These crazy bastards? My heart's pounding, if only I could just get hit and pass out already. His once confident expression turned grim as doubt seeped into his mind. Am I actually scared? He wondered bitterly. The crowd of students around them began shouting encouragement, their voices echoing across the hall. "Hickster, what are you doing? Don't go easy on him," one yelled. Others joined in, calling out titles he carried with pride. The Holy One of the Dolampe family. The Star of the Eastern Continent, a hope of all fistfighters, we believe in you. Another voice shouted. Aren't you dragging this out too long? Finish it already. Rage filled Hickster's chest. He clenched his teeth, furious that anyone would doubt him. How dare they, he thought, and then roared aloud. How dare, a mere mage? Fueled by anger, he charged forward, fists swinging with renewed fury. Aster watched his movements and smirked slightly. Ooh, not bad, he said calmly as Hickster unleashed a barrage of blows. Don't you dare look down on me, Hickster screamed as his fists hammered through the air. One of his strikes connected, forcing Aster to stumble back a few steps. The crowd erupted in cheers at the sight. Oof. Finally, that's our Hickster, they shouted. Hickster, breathing heavily, thought to himself. The feeling in my fist definitely tells me it was a direct hit, but why does it feel so light? Aster, who had been knocked off balance, smoothly flipped backward, landing on his hands before regaining his stance. Calmly brushing the dust off his clothes, he muttered, "Ah, dust." His composure stunned the onlookers, and Hickster's eyes widened in disbelief before he snapped again in frustration. Screaming, he charged toward Aster once more. Aster observed his opponent carefully, then glanced toward Damien. Damien keeps using healing magic on that guy, he thought. To end this, I'll have to knock him out in a single blow. He closed his eyes briefly, gathering mana into his palm as a surge of energy began to form. A technique I created with my comrades in my past life, he reflected silently. It draws out energy from the collision of mana particles. As Hickster closed the distance between them, the magic on Aster's hand grew brighter and denser. His expression remained calm and focused. It uses mana, but it's neither martial arts nor magic, he thought. A pure technique that simply utilizes the properties of mana. When Hickster came within striking range, Aster raised his hand and unleashed his technique with a powerful shout. Collision style! A deafening bang echoed throughout the hall, shaking the magical barrier that surrounded them. The students maintaining the field staggered backward under the force. One of them shouted in disbelief. What is this? Hickster stood frozen for a brief moment after taking the hit. Then, as if his body finally realized what had happened, he dropped to his knees before collapsing completely onto the floor. The hall fell silent. The students stared, stunned, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Aster slowly raised his right hand into the air and said calmly, "Cheers." He then spoke louder, his voice filled with faint amusement. Cheers, reactions, and responses. The silence shattered as the students erupted into wild cheers. So cool, they screamed. Is he really a mage? What is this, some kind of sweaty brawl? Others shouted excitedly. He did it, you bastards. This is what an underdog winning looks like. Off to the side, Damien waved his arms excitedly and shouted, "Friend, we won." Aster looked at him with a small smile, patted his head and replied, "Yeah." Inwardly, he added with a sigh, "So from now on, stop sucking your thumb." Meanwhile, the student who had been quietly observing everything from the back smirked faintly. To think a student of magic would fight like that, he muttered. How vulgar. Before the crowd could continue celebrating, a booming authoritative voice cut through the noise. Move it, you punks," the man shouted as he pushed through the students. "Who in the world starts a brawl on the day of the entrance ceremony? Is it you, or is it you?" He glared at the stunned faces in front of him and barked, "If you don't move right now, I'm taking you all in." Aster watched the man approach and sighed inwardly. I'm in trouble, he thought. But it's fine, after all, I'm a troubleshooter. There are plenty of ways to escape, and since everyone enjoyed it, they won't forget it easily. Before he could plan his next move, Damien suddenly raised his hand and shouted at the top of his lungs. "It's not them, it's us. It's us, I tell you. Over here, over here." Aster closed his eyes in disbelief as the man turned toward them, grinning darkly. "Oh ho, so, it's you punks?" he barked. Damien proudly puffed out his chest and shouted, "That's right, it's us." Later, the man brought Aster and Damien down to his office. After a short conversation, he called out their names. Both of them immediately responded. The man asked if they had confessed honestly, to which they answered that they had. Hearing this, the man said that he would let the matter slide this time without any penalty, since the other student had not been seriously hurt. He warned, however, that he would be keeping a close eye on them from now on. Aster nodded silently in acknowledgement, while Damien seemed relieved. Not long after, they arrived at the entrance ceremony. Looking around, Aster muttered to himself that he was thankful the ceremony had not started yet. As he and Damien walked down the aisle in search of a seat, whispers began spreading among the other students. Some commented in disbelief that Aster had managed to beat a martial arts student with his body type, while others questioned how a magic major could possibly fight like that. Damien grinned and waved at the crowd, amused by the attention. "Wow, everyone's staring at us," he said cheerfully. Aster muttered under his breath, "Damn, we're practically celebrities. Stop waving already." They soon spotted a few familiar faces. Damien pointed ahead and exclaimed that their friends had saved them seats, expressing his thanks with a wave. "Nice one, guys?" he called out. Aster followed behind with a small nod and replied casually, "Yeah, I guess so." After a while, the old headmaster appeared on stage and began his address. His speech stretched on for quite some time, filled with remarks about continuing the teachings of the first headmaster and the academy's long-standing traditions. Every so often, he paused to clear his throat or repeated transition phrases such as "furthermore" and "however." Aster sat quietly, listening with mild detachment, while Damien had already fallen asleep beside him as drool began to pool on his mouth. Watching this, Aster thought to himself that it was impressive how the old man could continue standing and talking for so long. Glancing at Damien, he sighed and muttered, "Tisk, this guy." Reaching over, he took Damien's hand and used it to wipe his own drool, saying under his breath, "Quit drooling already." Moments later, someone walked briskly to the stage and whispered something into the headmaster's ear. The old man frowned slightly and spoke into the microphone, asking, What could be more important than the entrance ceremony?" After a few whispered exchanges, he cleared his throat and addressed the students. He apologized, explaining that something urgent had come up, and announced that he would end his speech there and let the ceremony continue without him. Almost immediately, a fine shit in a refined uniform walked up to the stage. Her sharp, commanding voice carried clearly across the hall. "Attention everyone," she shouted, causing the students to flinch, and even startling Damien awake. "I am Zaria," she continued. "I will be conducting the entrance ceremony in place of the headmaster, who was called away unexpectedly. Let's begin with the entrance oath. First, the representative of the magic division, Dahlia did deny. At the front of the hall, a young woman stood from her seat and answered, yes. She began walking toward the stage with composed grace. As she passed, the nearby students started murmuring to each other in hushed tones. One student asked incredulously whether the Deny family had truly needed to take the entrance exam. Another scoffed, suggesting they must be lacking in skill, while a third quickly silenced them, explaining that Dahlia was the head's third child and that the Deny family would never have permitted her to take the exam if she lacked talent. Watching her closely, Aster recalled her identity. Dahlia did deny. He remembered her well. If the Declan family was the foremost magic house in the East, then the Deny family ranked just below them. Among the members of that family, Dahlia had been raised as the future representative magician of the house that was always second best. She had decent ability and had helped him a great deal when he retired as a troubleshooter. Yet, he thought, they had been more rivals in mischief than benefactors to one another. Still, he found it pleasant to see her joining this year's intake. When Dahlia reached the center of the stage, Zaria called for the next student. Next, the representative of the martial arts division, Paul, stepped forward. A boy stood up from his seat and responded quietly, yes. He walked toward the stage with steady steps. Watching him, Aster noted that since his family name had not been mentioned, he was likely not from a noble house. He thought to himself that the great houses must be fuming over it, and vaguely recalled that the Hickster, or was it Hipster, family had only been of that level as well. After both Dahlia and Paul completed their oaths, they walked down from the stage. Zaria then announced that it was time to introduce the professors who would be guiding the 172nd class, calling for them to step forward one at a time. As the introductions began, Aster's eyes followed the professors lined along the side of the stage. Just before Dahlia descended the stairs, he felt a strange sense that someone among them was looking straight at him. He turned his head slightly, scanning the crowd, but quickly dismissed the thought. Not that it really matters, he thought to himself. A moment later, Dahlia misstepped on the stairs and tripped forward with a startled cry. "Ack!" she exclaimed as she fell. Aster's gaze shifted to the next professor taking the stage, and he muttered quietly, "That's Professor Faroon, right? When's he coming up?" Soon after, the man he had mentioned stepped forward and introduced himself with a steady tone. "Greetings, I'm Professor Faroon, and I'll be in charge of the basic principles of magic course." Aster studied him thoughtfully. He had expected someone with a demeanor more similar to Wenji's, but Faroon's presence felt entirely different. Then again he reminded himself, Wenji's public face was that of a perfect gentleman, so he decided not to judge too quickly. After the introductions ended, Zaria concluded the event. She thanked the students for their attention and announced that the ceremony had officially ended. The students were instructed to follow the staff to their assigned dormitories. As everyone stood, Aster turned to see Damien still sleeping soundly. He leaned over and said flatly, "Get up." Damien blinked groggily. "Huh? It's over?" Aster replied with a completely straight expression. "No, you got caught sleeping and were expelled. Time to go home." For a moment, Damien froze. His eyes widened, and his entire face twisted in disbelief and terror before he suddenly screamed out loud, his voice echoing through the hall. Later that day, at the dormitory area, Aster sighed deeply as he walked down the corridor. "Didn't think a little teasing would make you scream like that," he muttered to himself. He stopped in front of his door and added quietly, "So this is it." Upon entering, he observed the room's layout and noted that it was located on the top floor. He thought silently that the academy truly was something else. On the bed, a neatly wrapped package had been placed. Aster assumed it contained the standard living supplies and began unpacking it while arranging his belongings. As he worked, he reflected that the academy had issued identical supplies so that every student would begin on equal footing. Still, he mused, even the smallest possessions could reveal a person's background, and in time, everyone would likely replace them with their own things. Suddenly, the door opened behind him. Aster turned his head and thought, "Roommate?" A student entered the room, and Aster immediately recognized him as Paul. The boy's expression, however, was far from friendly. Paul sighed, closing his eyes briefly before speaking in a composed, detached voice. "Let's keep things as quiet as possible," he said. "I don't care what you do. Stay up late if you want, but I'd rather we didn't interfere with each other. Of course, that also includes conversation from this point on. Understood?" Aster fell silent for a moment as he reflected inwardly. He observed Paul and thought to himself, "Look at this guy." Paul then spoke again, asking why Aster was not responding. In his mind, Aster mused that Paul had been the top student of the martial arts department, and wondered just how skilled he truly was. Without warning, Aster lunged forward to test him. In an instant, Paul grabbed his sword, ready to draw it, and shouted, "What do you think you're doing?" Aster, who had halted midway, looked down at his hands and thought, "Oh, impressive." He noted the way Paul held his sword, adjusting its position so that it would not strike anything around him when drawn, and silently acknowledged, "Not bad." Suddenly, Damien's voice rang out from outside the door, urgently calling, "Friend, hurry up and come out." Aster sighed and finally spoke aloud, saying, "What do you mean? I was just about to leave." He then tapped Paul on the shoulder and added, "Let's do it your way. In exchange, let's agree not to say anything even if I sing past midnight. Got it?" As Aster and Damien walked out of the dormitory, Damien asked excitedly, "Friend, who's your roommate?" Aster replied flatly, "I don't know." Damien repeated in disbelief, "You don't know? You don't know who it is?" Inwardly, Aster recalled that his roommate had been sleeping soundly like a log. Damien, undeterred, continued with enthusiasm. Anyway, let's go look around the academy. Lancey said there's a ton to see at the academy. She said we absolutely have to see it on the first day, but she also said I had to go with a friend. Aster understood her intention. Xenion Academy was vast, and she was subtly urging him to learn the layout so he would not get lost. He thought to himself that it was not a bad idea, as there was something he wanted to investigate anyway. Though not as sharp as in his past life, his senses were picking up something unusual. Closing his eyes, Aster focused and began to detect presences atop the surrounding buildings. He identified one of them as Declan's troubleshooters and smirked inwardly, wondering just how many of them were stationed there. Speaking aloud again, he urged, "Let's hurry and go look around." Damien and Aster soon arrived at a lake on campus. Damien was awestruck, exclaiming, "Whoa, it's a lake! A lake! We don't have anything like this at my house?" Feeling weary, Aster reflected that this excursion felt like taking a child around, and he suspected that was precisely why Lancey had paired him with Damien. Still, as someone who always repaid his debts, even in twisted ways, he offered a suggestion. "Then ask them to build you one." When Damien looked puzzled, Aster elaborated with a smirk. "All you have to do is dig a hole and fill it with water." Damien was delighted by the idea and declared, I'll ask them to make one bigger and wider than that one?" At that exact moment, back at the Blando mansion, Lancey, who was washing dishes, suddenly choked. Returning to the academy, Damien asked what a good name for the lake might be. After a brief pause, Aster suggested, "Blood, Sweat, and Tears." Damien enthusiastically approved. "I love it." Simultaneously, Lancey felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. Damien then pointed to a nearby statue and exclaimed, "Look at that statue over there. It's so cool." Aster, maintaining his playful tone, replied, "Ask them to build one for you too, as Blood, Sweat, and Tears number 2. When Damien agreed with excitement, Aster added, "Let's make it in the shape of a dragon. Their scales are beautiful." Damien once again responded with glee, "Awesome! I love it." Back at the Blando mansion, Lancey shivered again and wondered aloud to herself, What is this? Why am I suddenly getting chills?" After their tour, Aster announced, "All right, we've seen everything. Shall we go now?" Damien readily agreed. "Okay." As they prepared to leave, Aster's attention drifted. He mentally tallied that he had located about 7 troubleshooters, and including those he had not yet identified, their number was likely around 10. Mapping their distribution, he deduced that their central focus was the second magic hall, the building housing Professor Faroon's laboratory. He realized that his suspicion had been correct. Their target was indeed Professor Faroon. Declan must have concluded that Wenji had an accomplice, and was now investigating the professor due to his known connection to Wenji. At that moment, Aster noticed another troubleshooter trailing them from behind. He grinned inwardly, thinking, "I was wondering why they hadn't followed me yet, but they've latched on at just the right time. Shall we find out just how much they know?" Later that night, a hooded and masked troubleshooter moved stealthily, through grass, over poles, across trees and onto rooftops, until he reached a specific room. Inside, another troubleshooter awaited him and greeted, "You're here." The newcomer asked, "Where are the others?" The other man replied that they had gone ahead because an urgent directive had come down from higher command. All operatives were to gather at the target's nest. When the newcomer inquired whether the target was the main or the sub, he was told it was the sub. Significant intelligence had been obtained, and the word was that the objective would be handed over to the sub-target that night at midnight. The troubleshooter processed this and realized that the main target, Wenji, had made a move. The fact that the directive had been issued meant that the sub-target under their surveillance, Professor Faroon, was the one in question. He then voiced his concern. "Wait, then what about the single numbers? You're telling us to break through those monstrous professors? We'd need at least number 1, 2, or 3 to handle them." The other troubleshooter responded that number 1 was not coming, nor were any of the other single numbers. Frustrated, the first troubleshooter clutched his head and cursed, "Ha, fuck." However, the other troubleshooter added, "Callahan, the fire demon, will be joining us." The first troubleshooter's eyes widened in shock. He recognized Callahan as the vice commander of Declan's Mage Corps, known as the Crimson Jade. While that level of power should suffice, he grimly reflected on Callahan's reputation, a cold-hearted operative who would stop at nothing to complete a mission. In other words, they were being ordered to lay down their lives if necessary. The other troubleshooter tried to reassure him, saying that things might not necessarily escalate into a direct fight, as it would be burdensome for any prominent mage's identity to be exposed during a mission. The first troubleshooter conceded, "Oh right, I should think of it that way." With that, they resolved to move out immediately to join the others and increase their chances of survival, however slightly. As they leapt out the window, Aster, who had been perched at the edge of a nearby building observing and listening to their entire exchange, murmured to himself, "Tonight, at midnight? And Callahan, you say?" Aster thought silently to himself as the name Callahan came to mind. Callahan had already been a man in his prime back when Aster was still active. After the House of Declan had risked everything in a war against the House of Blando, Callahan Callahan had remained with the collapsing family, proving his unshakable loyalty. Aster acknowledged that Callahan was dangerous now, but he also knew that the man's true golden age had come after the war with Blando. He recalled that Callahan had earned the title of the Unstoppable Inferno of Declan, a name that had carved itself into the history of war mages. Because of that, Aster decided that he had to obtain him. Callahan's fire magic was one of Declan's secret arts, and as one of the most renowned mages on the entire continent, he was more than worth the risk. Aster realized then why the troubleshooter who had been tailing them earlier had fallen back. They had stumbled upon an unexpected opportunity. Still, there was something that didn't make sense to him. The target the enemy referred to, the thesis written by Henji, was currently in his possession, yet the troubleshooters had mentioned that the target would be delivered to the sub-target, Professor Faroon. He considered this carefully. The thesis he held could not possibly be a fake, and there was no chance that the target the enemy spoke of referred to anything other than that document. That could only mean one thing: the target being delivered that night was a counterfeit thesis. Meanwhile, at Aster and Paul's dormitory, Paul was getting ready to leave. He put on a hooded cloak and glanced at Aster, who appeared to be asleep on the bed. He stared at him for a moment before quietly slipping out of the room, but what Paul did not realize was that the person lying on the bed was not Aster at all. It was only a dummy. At the same time, in Professor Faroon's office, the old man sat behind his desk reading through some papers. He sighed and muttered under his breath, cursing the Declan family. He had been aware of their activities for some time but had chosen to ignore them, since they had yet to cross the line. Now, however, it seemed they had decided to invade his territory directly. The boldness of their actions made him wonder what exactly they were planning. A faint noise came from outside his door, causing him to pause. He understood immediately and whispered to himself that this was it. Moments later, the door creaked open and a man in a hood and mask entered the room. Faroon immediately identified him. "Paul," he said. Paul stiffened, startled that his professor had recognized him despite the disguise. Faroon continued in a calm tone, explaining that the next time Paul attempted stealth, he should refine the properties of his ether first. That was the very foundation of stealth. Faroon's voice carried the faintest hint of cold amusement as he added that this advice would only help him if there was a next time. Paul silently handed him a document. Faroon took it and examined it closely, muttering the name Henji under his breath. He recognized the handwriting. That man had gone to great lengths to find a way to deliver the thesis under Declan's nose, only to be caught in such an anticlimactic manner. But Faroon quickly dismissed the idea. Someone as cunning as Henji would never be captured that easily. Something about this felt wrong. He wondered to himself what Henji was really plotting. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed outside, and then the office door exploded inward with a deafening blast. A wave of smoke and fire filled the room. A man stepped through the shattered doorway, his tone disturbingly polite as he introduced himself. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Professor Faroon," the stranger said. "My name is Callahan, though I doubt a professor who's always locked away in his lab would have heard of me." Paul's expression turned tense as his hand instinctively reached for his sword. Faroon, however, remained calm as he observed the intruder. Callahan laughed loudly and gestured toward Paul, mocking him. He remarked that it seemed they had another guest in the room, a mercenary by the looks of it. Then, turning to Faroon again, he asked if the professor knew who he was. Faroon replied coldly that he had never heard the name before. Callahan's eyes widened at the insult. Faroon rose from his chair, his expression stern, and told him to stop with the nonsense and state his business. The smile on Callahan's face twisted into something darker. His tone dropped as he said that the stench of the professor and his allies was so foul it made his nose rot. Then, laughing maniacally, he shouted that he had never been treated like this before, and that it was actually quite fun. "Well then," Callahan declared, "shall I get right to the point?" He pointed directly at Paul and announced that the young man was going to die. A small magic circle ignited at the tip of his finger as he turned his gaze to Faroon, and added that he might leave the professor alive, but only with one eye and one arm. In an instant, Faroon grabbed the documents from his desk and stepped protectively in front of Paul. A massive ice magic circle appeared in front of his hand, and a powerful explosion shook the entire second magic hall. Flames surged violently through the room as Faroon's ice magic shielded them from the inferno. He looked over his shoulder at Paul and spoke firmly, telling him to do as he wished. From that moment on, Faroon would no longer see him as a student, but as a mercenary, one responsible for his own life. Paul drew his sword, nodding in understanding. Faroon assessed the situation quickly. Despite the explosion's intensity, no alarms had sounded throughout the academy. That could only mean that Declan's men had cast a soundproofing spell around the entire building. He realized he would have to rely on this so-called rookie mercenary beside him. Across the room, Callahan sneered. His eyes flicked to the file in Faroon's possession. He confirmed his suspicion that it had come from that Blando trash, as he called it, and noted that Faroon clearly had no intention of surrendering it peacefully. Callahan wondered aloud what he should do and then grinned. "Shall we have a little fun?" he said. A surge of magical energy erupted from beneath his feet as a fiery circle materialized, flames roaring and twisting around him. The heat intensified, melting the edges of Faroon's ice barriers. Outside, other troubleshooters began arriving, drawn by the magical disturbance. Callahan's laughter echoed through the hall as the inferno expanded, engulfing the room. Paul charged forward, blade ready, while Faroon extended his arm again, casting another spell. Ice and fire collided, producing an even greater explosion that shattered the upper section of the second magic hall. From a nearby rooftop, Aster watched the chaos unfold from the shadows, a hood concealing his face. A small smile crossed his lips as he muttered to himself that it had finally begun. He reached into his cloak, pulled out a mask, and placed it over his face. "It's been a while," he murmured quietly. Not as Aster, but as troubleshooter number 1. He then stood up and declared, "All right, shall we begin?" Immediately afterward, he began to pray aloud. "Oh Lady Moon, please allow me to be a righteous troubleshooter again today." After a few moments of silence, he opened his eyes and muttered to himself, "Though, to be honest, I've never actually been righteous." In the next instant, he leapt forward. Elsewhere, inside the second magic hall, a violent battle was already underway. The entire building began to explode from within. Callahan stood at the heart of the chaos, laughing loudly as he unleashed wave after wave of fire magic. He taunted, "You're holding out well, aren't you, mercenary?" At the front lines, Paul was breathing heavily. Inwardly, he cursed, "Damn it, to think the charm the captain gave me was a protective artifact. I was lucky." From the side, Professor Faroon spoke firmly, "Out of my way." He cast another ice spell, and in an instant the area around them was encased in thick ice as he attempted to block Callahan's relentless fire magic. Faroon then gripped Paul's shoulder and said, "Not bad. I suppose I can trust you a little more." Suddenly, Paul felt ice magic begin to coil around his sword. Stunned, he muttered to himself in disbelief. "Ether on his sword? Is that an enchantment?" Faroon turned to him and asked, "Can you block this?" Paul responded without hesitation, "As many as you want." In his mind, however, he acknowledged the grim reality. "It's not a matter of if I can anymore. If I fail, I die." At the front, Callahan grinned as he observed the pair and remarked, "A magician and garter, a solid combination of course." He then unleashed an even more powerful fire spell that shattered the ice wall before them. Paul swung his newly enchanted sword to intercept the next attack. Meanwhile, Faroon, who was fending off other troubleshooters from the rear, thought to himself, "The garter has been dealt with. At this rate, I'll just end up getting dragged around. In that case, I'll have to make a gamble. When the amount of mana distributed in nature is limited, if multiple entities issue commands, a battle for control begins between those entities. Now then, how much can you take from me?" A surge of powerful magic enveloped both Paul and Faroon. Witnessing this, Callahan called out with amusement, "Well, look at this. Are you challenging me to a power struggle?" He grinned widely and added, "All right, shall we have a go?" Then, with a booming laugh, purple flames and crackling lightning erupted from his body. Despite their efforts, another deafening explosion rocked the battlefield. Callahan's power swelled even further, overwhelming Paul, who was flung upward by the sheer force of the shockwave. As he soared helplessly through the air, Paul thought bitterly, "Damn it, every single one of them is a monster. There's no opening to jump in." He crashed hard onto the ground and groaned, "If this was going to happen, you all should have just fought each other from the start." The collision between Callahan's fire magic and Faroon's ice magic generated a massive tornado that swept away debris across the area. From a distance, the remaining troubleshooters watched in stunned silence. One of them finally spoke, voice tight with awe and fear. "Damn, this is brutal. Stand by. Rushing in now would be suicide. Get your breath back while you can. How many troubleshooters are left?" Before he could finish, a mysterious force surged through their ranks, knocking several of them off their feet. Another troubleshooter cried out in shock, A surprise attack! It's a surprise attack!" It was Aster, rushing toward the battlefield at blinding speed. He arrived with a thunderous crash that shook the ground. Both Callahan and Faroon immediately turned their gazes toward him. Aster spoke in a chilling tone, "And now for my grand entrance." His words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. Then Callahan shouted furiously, "Are you kidding me?" In the same instant, Aster shot forward with lightning speed, closing the distance in a flash. He seized Callahan by the throat and snarled, "Callahan, this spot will be your grave. Die!" Callahan barely managed to react in time. At point-blank range, he cast a spell directly into Aster's chest. The resulting explosion sent both combatants reeling. Callahan staggered backward, sliding to a halt before violently coughing up blood. He thought to himself, "Damn it, the mana backlash!" Aster pressed forward again, but Callahan, still choking on blood, could not respond. Just then, the other troubleshooters rushed in to intercept Aster's assault. Seizing the moment, Callahan grabbed a potion, thought urgently, "I have to suppress the mana backlash first." He drank it down and added under his breath, "Where the hell did a guy like that come from?" His thoughts were abruptly cut short as he looked up and saw Aster completely dominating the group of troubleshooters surrounding him. Callahan's eyes widened in genuine shock as he muttered, This is, his movements, not a single one is wasted, the pinnacle of efficiency, and on top of that, his magic is perfectly optimized for speed. Am I actually impressed?" A few moments later, Callahan formed multiple magic circles in front of him and unleashed another barrage of spells. He roared, "I don't know who the hell you are, but I'll kill you." With that, he fired the devastating magic directly at Aster, and inadvertently at the other troubleshooters caught in the line of fire. A deafening explosion erupted in the sky, shaking the ground beneath. Callahan coughed up blood, his chest heaving as he muttered weakly to himself, wondering if he had managed to hit his opponent. A twisted grin spread across his bloodied face as he noted that some of his fellow troubleshooters had likely been caught in the blast as well, but he didn't care. What mattered to him was the mission's completion, nothing else. When he looked upward, he saw charred bodies slowly falling from the air, their flesh burned to a crisp. He sneered coldly, reasoning that the masked man he had been fighting was a threat that needed to be eliminated at all costs. Reaching into his magical inventory, Callahan pulled out 2 more potions, his smirk widening. He admitted to himself that he had gotten overly excited, something quite unlike his usual cold and calculated demeanor. If he could regroup with the remaining troubleshooters, he believed they could still bring down Professor Faroon. Just as he raised another potion to his lips, a voice echoed chillingly through the air. "Is that all you've got?" It taunted. Callahan froze, his hand trembling. The voice continued, each word slicing through the silence. Aster's tone was calm but cutting as he mocked Callahan's dual nature, how he looked like a madman outwardly, but was as cold and calculating as a snake within. Aster revealed that he had known from the very beginning that Callahan intended to blow him up along with the other troubleshooters. Standing high above, Aster pointed his hand down at Callahan, his fingers shaped like a gun. His eyes glowed faintly as he declared that Callahan's ruthlessness would be the cause of his defeat. A flash of light followed, and before Callahan could react, a streak of magic shot through the air and struck him square in the speed of the attack was blinding. He barely had time to whisper in disbelief about how fast it was before his body stiffened. His ponytail snapped loose, and a thin stream of blood gushed from his forehead as his body toppled lifelessly to the ground. Aster descended quietly, landing beside the fallen mage. He gazed down at Callahan's corpse and thought to himself that the man's reputation as a war mage had been well earned. Any other mage would have died instantly from such a surprise attack, but Callahan had at least managed to react and counter before dying. His reaction and judgment were undeniably sharp. Aster then reflected that Callahan's final spell had been useful to him. If Callahan had chosen to join forces with the other troubleshooters and drag the confrontation into a war of attrition, Aster admitted he might have lost. His mana reserves were still limited compared to what they once had been. He knelt beside the corpse and began rummaging through Callahan's belongings, humming to himself. Eventually, he found what he was looking for and pulled out a small enchanted pouch. With a faint smile, he confirmed his suspicion. Most combat mages didn't trust anyone and always carried their secret arts with them. The pouch was protected by a subspace pocket with a basic owner recognition spell. He decided he could undo it later at his leisure. Then, sensing someone approaching, Aster turned toward the figure emerging from the shadows. "You're late, Professor Faroon," he said flatly. Faroon appeared calm but wary. He explained that he had been delayed freezing some rats, raising one hand as a small burst of ice magic gathered in his palm, then asked coldly if Aster was one of them as well. Aster exhaled heavily, muttering that one person had been a madman and the other a fighting cock. He asked what Faroon thought about the fact that he had just killed one of Declan's men. Faroon fell silent for a moment, studying him closely. After a pause, he lowered his hand and concluded that since Aster had called the other man a madman, he must have been the messenger Wenji had sent. He corrected Aster, stating that he was not a fighting cock. Aster wondered internally if Faroon was really trusting him based on that flimsy reasoning. Faroon then asked about a supposed mercenary who had approached him earlier, wondering if Wenji had split his thesis into 2 parts. Aster told him that he hadn't heard anything about it, but it was likely a fake. Wenji probably used a decoy to lure Declan's agents out into the open while simultaneously trying to strengthen the defenses in the city of Hazen and at the academy. It was also a strategic move to reduce Declan's influence. Inwardly, Aster noted that despite the troubleshooter's blackout spell, the battle had been large-scale enough that the Imperial Knights should have arrived by now. The delay didn't make sense, which led him to suspect that the Declan family had interfered with the Knights' movements. Faroon broke his train of thought by asking if Aster was truly the messenger. Aster handed over the thesis papers. Faroon skimmed the pages, his expression unreadable, before looking up and asking if Aster knew what was written inside. Aster smirked slightly and replied that he didn't just know the contents, he understood them. Faroon nodded faintly, recognizing the confidence in his tone. Aster then remarked that he didn't mind a fight, but preferred not to lose a reliable ally. After a moment of silence, Faroon tucked the thesis into his coat pocket and agreed to accept it for now. He said he didn't want to lose an ally either, so he would let things slide. Then, with a measured tone, he asked if there was anything Aster wanted in return. Wenji, he explained, only trusted people with clear desires aligned with his own. To build trust, he would need to give Aster something as well. Aster thought for a moment, then answered simply, he wanted a book. Faroon raised an eyebrow, asking for clarification. Aster explained that he planned to build a grand tower filled with books that anyone could read. He asked Faroon to contribute a volume detailing his personal perspectives on magic. Faroon sighed, pressing a hand to his forehead before giving a faint smile. He admitted that writing such a book might be fun, though he doubted many people would be able to understand it. Satisfied, Aster turned to leave, saying he should get going. Faroon stopped him, asking how they were supposed to stay in contact, especially since Aster would need to deliver the next thesis eventually. Aster grimaced at the idea, muttering that he'd rather not exchange contact information with another man. After a moment of awkward silence, he pulled something from his subspace pocket, a pair of small crystals, and tossed one to Faroon. He explained that they were linked communication crystals. If one broke, the other would shatter as well. Breaking one meant Aster would come. Breaking 2 or more meant trouble, in which case he would not come looking. Faroon accepted it with a dry response, saying that he didn't like men either. As Aster departed, Faroon stood alone for a long time before murmuring to himself that, for some reason, he suddenly felt uneasy. Not long after, the Imperial Knights finally arrived. They swiftly secured the area and began evacuating the Academy students as a precaution against further attacks. Aster, blending in effortlessly among the crowd, joined the students outside. Damien, still half asleep and rubbing his eyes, spotted him and asked where he had been, saying it felt like he hadn't seen him in ages. Aster replied curtly that he had needed to drop a big one. As Damien blinked in confusion, Aster's thoughts drifted again. He reasoned that with Callahan and the troubleshooters dead, the Declan family would likely lie low for a while. Damien interrupted his thoughts with a ridiculous question, asking if he had been constipated and offering to heal him. Aster ignored him, still lost in contemplation. He began analyzing why his sigil had reacted during the battle. Normally it was unresponsive, but when he blocked Callahan's final spell, the sigil's energy had infused his force field, strengthening it. Because of that, he had managed to withstand the counterattack unharmed. It wasn't that the barrier itself had grown sturdier, it had been something else, more like an exclusion phenomenon, a technique commonly used by elemental mages to prevent self-inflicted damage during combat. He compared it mentally to how Callahan had recklessly unleashed fire magic without harming himself. Still, Aster couldn't understand why the sigil had activated then, of all times, or what its precise conditions were. He decided he would have to investigate it further. Damien's voice cut through his thoughts, urging him to take off his pants for some absurd reason. Aster sighed and replied that he wouldn't, then silently resolved to visit Lapdog, the largest library in the East, located within the Academy. He was certain he would find clues there. As he pondered his next move, a voice called out from behind him. When he turned, a man approached with a friendly grin and introduced himself as Chenbi. Aster eyed him warily and asked what he wanted. Chenbi said he had been impressed by Aster's fighting skills, noting that he was a pretty good fighter. Aster narrowed his eyes, wondering privately if Chenbi had seen him during the battle. If that were the case, his identity might be compromised. A cold thought crossed his mind. If Chenbi truly had seen too much, he might have to eliminate him. Aster's thoughts were interrupted when Chenbi spoke in his usual cheerful tone. Chenbi said that what had impressed him most was Aster's fight with the martial arts group on the first day of school, and he asked how Aster was able to fight like that. Aster smirked awkwardly, and thought that instead of leaving a bad impression, he had ended up making quite a name for himself. Still, he noticed that Chenbi addressed him rather casually, without any of the respect that others might have used when speaking to someone of his status. Aster replied that the martial artist simply did not have enough ether yet and that things would be different once he did. Chenbi laughed awkwardly and said he understood. Then, with a hint of shyness, he admitted that there was nothing special behind his words. He just wanted to be around someone. He confessed that he did not have any close friends yet and found it hard to fit in. Aster, understanding how he felt, thought to himself that he could relate. An awkward silence followed before Chenbi spoke again. He said that although the Academy promised equality regardless of social status, that fairness existed only from the Academy's official standpoint, not among the students themselves. For someone like him, who came from a poor family, it was natural to feel like an outsider. Then, almost as if to reassure himself, he added that it did not really matter in the end. Aster replied indifferently that it was fine, whatever he wanted. Chenbi exhaled with relief and smiled, admitting that he had been worried. He said that it was unsettling to be alone in situations like that. Aster reluctantly agreed that it was true. Chenbi then began another topic, continuing their conversation, and as time passed, Aster found himself reflecting. He realized that what they were having was what most people would call a normal conversation. He thought to himself that throughout his life, he had only met eccentric or dangerous people and had almost forgotten what it felt like to speak with someone ordinary. With a faint smile, he told himself that his academy life was finally beginning. The next day, at the lecture hall, Damien yawned and complained that he was sleepy. Beside him, Aster was quietly reading a book when Chenbi appeared again, greeting them both enthusiastically. Aster and Damien returned the greeting as Chenbi sat down. Chenbi remarked that even after the commotion from the day before, they still had classes, and he joked that it seemed excessive. Aster agreed. As Aster glanced at Chenbi, he thought about what he had learned from their conversation the previous day. From what Chenbi had said, he did not seem to be from a noble or wealthy family. Still, despite his humble background, he carried himself with confidence and good humor, showing no sign of intimidation. Aster thought that Chenbi was, in his eyes, a decent friend. Chenbi then brought up another topic, saying that he had heard some news earlier that morning. Their homeroom teacher for the M3 class would be Professor Zera. Aster repeated the name, surprised. Chenbi responded eagerly, asking if he knew of her, explaining that she was famous for having slaughtered a group of trolls in a single strike. As Chenbi's eyes sparkled with admiration, he suddenly exclaimed that she had arrived. Aster looked toward the entrance and recognized her immediately. He remembered seeing her standing on the podium during the entrance ceremony the previous day. Professor Zera walked confidently to the front of the room and introduced herself to the class. She acknowledged that there had been a small commotion the day before but dismissed it as nothing of concern, urging everyone to focus on their studies. She then explained that before the first class began, they would be measuring their mana. The measurement, she said, would determine both the quantity and quality of each student's mana. She asked which of the two the students believed to be more important. One student quickly raised her hand. Zera asked for her name, and the girl introduced herself as Arzan. Zera gave her permission to answer. Arzan replied that there might not be a definitive answer, but if a person possessed a sufficient amount of mana, then the quality of that mana was more important. Zera asked her why she believed that. Arzan explained that when two mages of equal level competed, the mage with higher mana quality would have the advantage. From the back of the room, Aster listened and thought that her reasoning was sound. He considered how mana quality affected accuracy, stability, and power. He knew that no matter how much mana one possessed, it was useless if one could not hit the target. Still, before he could fully form his conclusion, Zera clicked her tongue sharply. The sound startled the class, and Arzan's expression darkened with embarrassment. Zera then asked which house Arzan was from. When Arzan replied that she was from the Marquis of Parayam, Zera sighed loudly in visible disappointment. Her expression turned to disgust as she muttered that it was no wonder. Arzan froze, clenching her lips as tears welled up in her eyes. Zera continued, asking if anyone else wanted to answer. When no one volunteered, she murmured to herself that no one seemed willing. Then, she suddenly pointed to another student and ordered him to stand. Startled, the student stammered nervously, replying, "Yes?" Zera coldly asked if that was his name. The student quickly corrected himself, saying his name was Ipley. Ipley stood and answered that he believed the quantity of mana was more important. In large-scale battles, he argued, the total amount of mana one possessed would have a greater impact. Aster silently agreed that in broader combat situations, the quantity of mana could indeed outweigh its quality. He summarized his thoughts inwardly, noting that depending on the circumstances, both aspects were equally important. Zera's expression, however, shifted into one of intense frustration. She demanded to know which house Ipley belonged to. When he admitted that he did not belong to any house, Aster was confused. He wondered privately whether he was missing something about her line of questioning. Zera moved on, calling for the next student. One by one, she asked the same question repeatedly, and each time, her disappointment deepened. Every answer she heard seemed to irritate her further, and she kept demanding to know the student's family origins. Aster watched the scene unfold, and thought that the way she kept repeating the same question while ignoring the answers meant that she was looking for something specific. He wondered what kind of answer was capable of ruining the classroom atmosphere so completely. After a long silence, Zera finally addressed the class. She said she had heard their answers, and admitted that many of them had been close to what could be considered correct. However, she clarified that there had never been a correct answer in the first place. She explained that what she had truly wanted from them was not the right response but a genuine one. She told them to think carefully about their own words. Had their answers reflected their own thoughts, or had they simply said what they believed she wanted to hear? Zera emphasized that a mage must never lose their subjectivity. They must not be swayed by others but instead remain firm in their own will at all times. She asked whether any of them possessed that mindset, the mindset of a true mage. The entire room fell silent. Zera told them that from that day forward, they must strive to become true mages. That, she said, was what she had wanted to convey through her questions, and she urged them to keep it in their hearts. The students were stunned by her words. Aster sighed quietly, thinking that his earlier assumption had been right. He reflected that her method was a cleverly twisted way to teach such a lesson. Zera then announced that it was time for each of them to have their mana measured. She called Arzan first. Arzan, still wiping tears from her eyes, responded immediately. Zera told her that she would serve as the class representative for M3, and that her initial answer had been impressive. She instructed her to record her classmates' mana levels from then on. Arzan hurried to the podium and thanked her profusely. At the back of the room, Aster watched with admiration, thinking that this was how Professor Zera trained her students, by breaking them down and rebuilding them with a stronger mindset. Beside him, Chenbi muttered enviously that he was jealous. Aster looked at him in confusion, wondering silently what exactly Chenbi was jealous of. Zera then called for her assistant professor. The assistant stepped forward carrying a covered object and placed it in the center of the room. When he removed the cover, the students gasped in awe. They recognized the object as a mana measuring device, and whispered that it was rare and difficult to obtain. Zera smiled slightly and placed her left hand on the device. She said that it was probably the first time any of them had seen one in person. She told them that it was now time to discover their own mana levels and added, with a sly grin, that there might even be a monster among them. Zaira began by explaining the procedure for using the crystal orb. She instructed Arzin to place her hand on the orb and infuse it with her mana. Arzin nodded respectfully and responded with a firm, "Yes, ma'am." As soon as her hand touched the smooth surface of the crystal, it began to glow faintly. The orb absorbed her mana and started calculating her magical power. After a few moments, the gathered data passed through a connected crystal rock, which emitted a beam of light upward, projecting Arzin's magical readings into the air for everyone to see. Pointing at the floating projection, Zaira explained in her calm, instructive tone that among the various indicators displayed, the most important one was the value at the center, the refinement level, which represented the quality of a person's mema. The scale ranged from 1 to 10, and Arzin's current refinement level was 4. She added that, since last year's incoming students had an average level of 3, Arzin's score could be considered excellent. Blushing slightly, Arzin thanked her nervously, but Zaira continued, saying that the process was not yet complete. The next test would measure mana capacity. She instructed Arzin to pour her mana into the crystal once again. Arzin did as she was told, and Zaira explained that mana capacity was divided into 100 levels. The orb recorded Arzin's capacity as level 17. Considering the previous year's average was 15, Zaira remarked that Arzin's result was slightly above average as well. She smiled warmly at the girl and praised her for her diligence, saying that her mana's quality and quantity reflected her hard work. Among the onlookers, Chenbi whispered in admiration, hoping that he would also achieve a high score. Sitting beside him, Aster smirked inwardly, thinking to himself that he could already see Arzin's future. She would surely grow into a hard-working graduate student. Zaira then announced that she had other matters to attend to and would be leaving. She instructed the students to continue the mana measurements under the assistant professor's supervision. The class responded in unison, affirming her command. One by one, the students approached the crystal orb to have their mana measured. Chenbi stood up eagerly and called for Aster to join him. Aster hesitated briefly but eventually rose as well. Before they could proceed, however, a sudden commotion erupted among the students. A wave of astonished voices filled the room. Someone exclaimed that a student had achieved a refinement level of 6, double the average. Another added that the same student's mana capacity had reached level 20, expressing envy and disbelief. The assistant professor, intrigued, asked for the student's name. Standing confidently, the young man replied that his name was Furion de Denai. Hearing this, Aster's eyes narrowed as he thought silently that Furion must belong to the same family as Delia Denai. Judging by the different hair color, he was likely from a branch family. Aster found it slightly pretentious that he had stated both his given name and full name aloud. After examining the results, the assistant professor praised Furion's numbers, noting that while his refinement level was impressive, his mana capacity was slightly lacking in comparison. Nevertheless, it remained an outstanding score for someone of his background. Furion merely nodded and acknowledged the comment with a curt, "I see." Meanwhile, Damien, who had been dozing off beside Aster, stirred awake with a yawn and complained about the noise. Aster replied playfully that nothing much was happening and told him to go back to sleep, though he thought to himself that Damien was incapable of sleeping during class anyway. Curious, Damien asked why everyone was getting their mana measured. Aster shrugged, saying he did not know but that it seemed worth trying. Before Aster could stop him, Damien shouted loudly across the room that he wanted to participate too. Aster sighed, covering his face with his palm, muttering to himself in embarrassment that Damien's sudden outbursts always drew attention. As the two of them, along with Chenbi, approached the front, whispers rippled among the students. Some recognized Damien as the young master of the Blando family, and remarked on how young he looked. Others identified Aster as the one who had defeated Hickster, the second son of the Delanpe family. A few wondered aloud who the third boy with them was. Aster groaned inwardly, lamenting that he had become known only for beating someone up. At the front, the assistant professor greeted them with a respectful tone, asking if the young master would like to have his mana measured first. Damien turned to Aster for confirmation and asked if he simply needed to channel his mana into the orb. Aster nodded silently, and Damien placed his hand on the crystal. A sudden glow illuminated the room, and gasps spread among the students. Some stammered in disbelief, wondering if what they were seeing was even possible. On the sidelines, Furion stared wide-eyed, calling Damien a monster under his breath. The assistant professor shouted in astonishment, reading the projection aloud. Damien's refinement level was 9, and his capacity level was 67. He questioned whether it might be an error. Aster observed the scene quietly, thinking to himself that this was how ordinary people reacted when confronted with true genius, something beyond their comprehension, an unreachable wall of brilliance. His gaze shifted to Damien, and he thought further that while he had always known Damien was gifted, he had not expected him to surpass the average by such an enormous margin. When Damien looked at his own results, he asked innocently if they were considered high. Aster reflected that this was how the monster of the Blando family came to be. Damien had simply been born different. In his previous life, if Damien had ever taken his training seriously, he might have reshaped the entire continent. Determined not to let history repeat itself, Aster resolved to help him rise above the ordinary so that the Blando family would forever remain a thorn in Declan's side. The assistant professor, sweating nervously, commended Damien's performance, saying that he truly lived up to his family's name. However, he warned him not to become complacent, reminding him that a mage's strength was not determined by mana alone. Damien replied cheerfully, promising to keep that in mind, before rushing over to Aster and asking whether his friend had taken the test yet. Aster admitted he had not, and Damien eagerly encouraged him to try. Aster glanced around at the crowd of watching students and thought to himself that everyone must be curious about his level. A commoner surrounded by nobles, a boy who had already defeated one of their own. He then announced aloud that he would give it a try. Approaching the crystal orb, he stared at it thoughtfully and decided that, to avoid unnecessary attention, he would aim for an average result. When the assistant professor asked for his name, he replied simply, Aster. The professor then told him to remove his hands from his pockets. Aster complied, placing one hand on the orb while thinking that he only needed to adjust the properties of his mana and channel an appropriate amount. However, as he began to do so, his eyes widened. He realized something was wrong. The baseline seemed far too low. He tried to restrain his output, but before he could react, the orb flashed brightly, and the projected result appeared before everyone's eyes. Refinement level 10. The orb began to flicker violently. The once blue light turned crimson, and the projection glitched erratically before displaying a message. Error limit exceeded. Please reset the baseline. The room erupted in confusion. Students murmured to one another, wondering aloud if such a thing was even possible. Damien, beaming with pride, shouted that it was amazing. Aster, however, turned calmly toward the assistant professor and suggested that there had been an error, requesting that they measure again. The assistant professor stuttered nervously but agreed. Damien's excitement faded into disappointment, and he muttered under his breath that it was not an error. Internally, Aster groaned and told himself to ignore him. Yet Damien's grin returned as he whispered knowingly that he could tell the reading was correct. Aster repeated silently in his mind, "Shut up." Once the assistant professor reset the device, Aster tried again. This time, the orb displayed a much more modest result. Refinement level 3, mana capacity 15. The students immediately began murmuring again, commenting that the earlier reading must indeed have been an error. Aster exhaled quietly in relief, thinking that it had worked this time because he was more careful, though maintaining balance was difficult. Then, without warning, Damien spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Bullshit," he said. Aster's expression froze. His relief evaporated as he turned toward his friend in disbelief, asking inwardly where he had learned such a word. Damien frowned and explained with irritation that his friend had told him this was the proper use of bullshit, repeating the phrase again to prove his point. Aster turned away, sighing internally, realizing he would need to be far more careful with his words from now on. Later that day, in the first magic hall, Zaira stood by the window, gazing out thoughtfully. She reflected that repairs on the second magic hall were progressing smoothly, but wondered why a Declan, and specifically a mage named Callahan, would have attacked Professor Faroon. After a moment, she sighed, reasoning that Professor Faroon had once been famous in his field and could surely handle himself. It was, she decided, none of her concern. Just then, her assistant entered and introduced himself as Yorbi, announcing that he had brought the data from that day's mana level tests. Zaira thanked him, took the documents and began reviewing them carefully. As she flipped through the results, she noted that the overall level of students this semester was quite high. She paused on Furion's record, remarking that it was somewhat disappointing for a deny. Turning the page, she examined Damien's data, acknowledging that his results were fitting for someone considered the greatest talent in Blando family history. He would, she thought, require careful guidance. Then her eyes widened when she came across Aster's record. The report indicated that his test had been retaken after an initial error. Yet, the error code signified something remarkable. The baseline had been exceeded. Her gaze hardened as she thought to herself that this boy, Aster, might be far more dangerous than he appeared. She resolved to keep a close eye on him. Elsewhere, Aster confronted Damien about his earlier language. He scolded him, declaring that only he was allowed to say bullshit. Damien protested indignantly, asking why he could not say it too. Before the argument could escalate, Chenbi interjected awkwardly and suggested that perhaps none of them should say it at all. As time passed, Aster, Damien, and Chenbi settled onto the ground, their posture relaxed yet attentive. Damien, ever precise, shaped a miniature dragon from pure mana, its scales shimmering faintly, its limbs articulated with uncanny realism. His expression remained serious as he set the figure carefully on the table and turned to Aster, asking whether he thought it was sufficient. Aster studied the construct intently. He tilted his head slightly, eyes tracing the curve of its spine, the tension in its coiled tail. After a moment of silence, he murmured that it should work, though not without reservation. Damien, satisfied, announced it as Blood, Sweat, and Tears No.2, clearly marking it as part of a series. Aster, however, was not quite ready to let it stand. He suggested refining the posture, making it more dynamic, as if caught mid-leap, wings flaring outward in preparation, neck arched forward, jaws parted wide. He referenced the lion statue in Damien's family estate, noting how its open-mouthed stance lent it an air of ferocity that a closed expression simply could not match. Chenbi, sitting just beside Aster, listened in stunned silence. He watched as Damien, without hesitation, without visible strain, adjusted the mana flow, subtly reshaping the dragon's limbs and spine until it embodied Aster's vision. Inwardly, Chenbi reeled. He recalled how even the Great Furion, a legend whose name still echoed in advanced mana theory lectures, had only ever stabilized a standard dodecahedron during his famed control trials. And yet here was Damien, treating an elite-tier mana manipulation exercise as if it were child's play, twisting, refining, improvising on the fly. The world, he realized with a sinking heart, was far wider than he had ever imagined. He let out a quiet, self-deprecating laugh. Ha ha. And thought bitterly that compared to such talent, he was nothing more than trash. Aster, sensing the shift in Chenbi's demeanor, glanced at him. He did not offer empty reassurance. Instead, he acknowledged the weight of that realization. He did understand how Chenbi felt, how impossible it was to measure oneself against a standard that seemed to bend reality. But understanding changed nothing. The only path forward was to accept the truth, however harsh, and keep moving. Just then, Damien's voice cut through the quiet. "Friend." Aster turned. "I had a really great time today. I think I really made the right choice coming to this academy." The words struck Aster like a physical blow. His eyes widened slightly, his breath caught. For a long moment, he simply stared at Damien, this peer whose brilliance was effortless, whose warmth was genuine, whose gratitude was sincere. Then, slowly, he exhaled. A faint smile touched his lips, and he spoke softly. "Is that so? I'm glad to hear that." Some time later, after the sun had shifted and shadows stretched longer across the training grounds, Aster returned to his personal chamber, a secluded space warded against outside detection. There, he sat cross-legged on the floor, the subspace pouch once belonging to Callahan resting in his lap. He turned it over in his hands. It was sealed with a mana pattern lock, a common security measure among high-rank mages. In theory, such locks were trivial for anyone versed in spell architecture. Once you understood how the mana signature was encoded, you could rewrite the binding sequence with minimal effort. With the right tools, a resonance tuner, a mana stabilizer, perhaps a focused crystal lens, he estimated he could have cracked it in under a week. But he had not dared. Too many eyes, too many ears. So he had worked in secret, night after night, in this room, refining his own mana to mimic key frequencies, testing minute fluctuations, waiting for the lock's harmonic resonance to waver. A full month had passed, and it had not been his only endeavor. He had dissolved the Blando family's elixir strand by strand, absorbing its alchemical framework into his own mana lattice. He had cross-referenced grimoire fragments from the Academy's restricted archives. He had practiced silent incantation until his breath no longer betrayed spellcasting. Now, at last, the seal yielded. He reached inside. First came a small glass vial. A potion, he noted, though its contents were indeterminate without further analysis. Next, he pulled out a massive, intricately embroidered garment, its fabric shimmering with arcane threadwork. He frowned, shook his head, and set it aside. "No, I can't use this." Then his fingers brushed against metal. He withdrew a bracelet, its surface etched with concentric runes pulsing faintly with stored energy. A protection artifact. He tested its resonance, moderate shielding capacity, layered enchantments, no obvious decay. Not bad, he judged. Useful, certainly, if not exceptional. He reached in again, deeper this time, fingers sifting past scrolls and vials and small wrapped parcels. He knew what he was looking for. It had to be here, and then, there. A leather-bound volume, its cover worn but intact, its spine reinforced with silver inlay. His pulse quickened. Found it. Declan's secret grimoire. He opened it, not fully, but just enough to confirm the title page. Red Fire. A lesser secret art than the infamous Blue Fire wielded by Farron, yet infamous in its own right. A flame said to burn through force fields, provided the caster had achieved absolute control. It was not a spell one learned in a night. It required years of refinement, of burning away imperfection, not just in technique, but in intent. Aster closed the grimoire and exhaled slowly. He would take his time. Mastery could not be rushed. He would study it in fragments, during breaks, after drills, in the quiet before dawn. Then, as if pulled by an external tide, his thoughts shifted. Speaking of which, isn't it today? The midterm performance evaluation season had begun. Outside, beneath a pale autumn sky, students gathered across the open training field. Aster, Damien and Chenbi arrived together. Damien's excitement was barely containable. He bounced slightly on his heels, eyes bright, voice ringing with boyish glee. Performance evaluation. Performance evaluation. Aster, standing beside him, scanned the crowd and remarked flatly that there were so many people. Chenbi nodded, explaining that all classes, from M1 through their own, had been summoned. Then he leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper, and asked if Aster had heard the rumor. Aster raised an eyebrow. What rumor? With a conspiratorial grin, Chenbi revealed it. A few M1 students had overheard administrative staff discussing canyon maintenance during the busy evaluation period. That, he insisted, was a dead giveaway. The event would almost certainly be canyon breakthrough. Aster fell silent. He reviewed the three possible formats in his mind. The trial of the ordeal, a labyrinthine sewer system, paths converging, emphasis on endurance and spatial awareness. Canyon breakthrough, a first-come, first-served race through a narrow ravine, chaos guaranteed, spells flying, alliances forming and shattering in seconds. The simulator, one-on-one sparring, pure skill, pure pressure. Of the three, Canyon Breakthrough was the most volatile, but also the most predictable in its unpredictability. Chenbi, he realized, had already begun mapping his strategy. Hold defensive barriers early, let the initial surge burn itself out, then surge forward in the lull. It was sound, calculated, survivable. But then, a sharp authoritative command cut through the chatter. Silence. A tall man with long black hair strode forward, his bearing rigid. He introduced himself as Professor Faroon, instructor of the M1 magic class and this evaluation's supervising authority. Aster's gaze sharpened. It's been a while, Professor Faroon. He noted the deep shadows beneath the man's eyes, the exhaustion, the strain, worse than before. Faroon continued, his voice dry but resonant. He confirmed the day's purpose, the midterm performance evaluation. Then came the announcement, the trial of the ordeal. Chenbi's face went slack, his shoulders sagged, his hands trembled at his sides. No way, he whispered inwardly. My whole plan. His carefully constructed mental model collapsed in an instant. Damien, standing just behind him, leaned forward and murmured a single word. Quiet, uninflected, yet devastating in its certainty. Liar. Chenbi groaned, half in protest, half in despair. Faroon, unmoved, ordered the students to line up by class. With a snap of his fingers, a holographic projection shimmered into existence behind him. A winding, pipe-like maze, slick with condensation, branching and rejoining. He explained the objective. Navigate the maze, reach the gate. All paths led there eventually, no need for panic. Chenbi let out a shaky breath. Phew, that actually sounds easy. Faroon's hand rose. Another snap. A new image materialized, a towering humanoid construct of stone and iron, joints reinforced with glowing mana conduits. It's a golem, Chenbi gasped aloud. What? There are golems in a performance evaluation? What is this? Damien turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing, voice low and warning. Watch your mouth, friend. Faroon elaborated. The golems were gatekeepers, stationed at key junctions. They were deliberately slowed, their cores exposed, their durability reduced, still dangerous for students, but survivable. Defeating them was optional. Evasion was permitted. The crowd stirred. Voices rose in concern. Even so, in such a narrow space, we'll be cornered instantly. If it were open field, maybe, but like this? Faroon's jaw tightened. He listened, his expression darkening. These are mages? They're not very composed. He thought of Paul, the boy who had pushed himself to collapse, who had bled mana from his fingertips just to stabilize one more rune. Were these students truly weaker, or merely coddled by comfort? His gaze swept the assembly again, and paused. There, trembling but standing firm, knuckles white, jaw set, determination, unrefined but real. There, another, eyes alight, breathing steady, already scanning the projected maze for weaknesses. And there, Damien, utterly relaxed, smiling faintly, as if the entire ordeal were no more taxing than a stroll through the academy gardens. Cancel that for this student. He looks like he doesn't have a single concern in the world. Faroon's voice cut through the murmurs like steel. Enough. Silence returned, heavier this time. He clarified. The golems would attack only those still protected by their test bracelets. Each student would receive one, a device emitting a mana-reinforced force field. If that field shattered, elimination was immediate, and golems would cease targeting the wearer. Then, slowly, he raised a bracelet for all to see. And then, his eyes narrowed, A faint, dangerous smile curled his lips. Show me something impressive. It did not matter who finished first. It did not matter who felled the most constructs. Only standout performance would be rewarded, and he promised, with absolute certainty, that his personal reward would be something worth their effort. Aster's grin spread wide, sharp, unguarded. A reward I won't be disappointed with, huh? Yes, this is it. Aster's thoughts drifted momentarily to his visits to the Academy's library. Lapdog, the largest repository of knowledge on the eastern continent. He recalled its three-tiered structure, the lower, middle, and upper floors. Of those, only the lower floor was accessible to students of his standing. When he had scoured it for any trace of information regarding the stigma, he found nothing. Not a single grimoire, not even a marginal footnote. To uncover a real clue, he would have to ascend. The middle or upper floors held what he needed, but entry there was reserved solely for the imperial family, the high nobility, or houses bearing centuries of distinction. Aside from lineage, the only alternate path was to secure formal recommendations from at least 3 professors, an almost impossible feat for someone like him, which was why the reward promised by Professor Faroon mattered so much. Without it, advancement remained out of reach. He exhaled inwardly. Rueful, he was only trying to stay in the middle, neither rising recklessly nor sinking into obscurity. Yet the people around him kept pulling him into conflict, one way or another. Still, a quiet grin returned to his face. He had memorized it, the cross-section layout of the sewer maze. Every branching corridor, every choke point, every golem placement inferred from past trial data. With that knowledge, he judged the midterm evaluation could be made easy. Moments later, Professor Faroon concluded the briefing. He granted the students time to prepare, instructing them to collect necessary items from the assistant professor. Almost immediately, chaos erupted. One student shouted across the yard, requesting bomb flowers and ignition stones. The assistant professor denied him instantly. His primary attribute was fire-based, and such tools would constitute an unfair advantage. Another cried out for a golem controller. The reply was swift and sharp. Trying to take a shortcut, denied. Aster observed the commotion with detached amusement. He murmured inwardly that it was difficult to distinguish whether these were aspiring mages or street thugs, staging a marketplace brawl. Then his attention shifted as Damien bounded forward, calling out cheerfully, "Sir, vine seeds, please! 20 should be enough." The assistant professor hesitated, noting that Damien's official attribute was unregistered. But before he could finish the objection, Damien dropped to knee, activated a delicate plant-based spell, and beamed up at the professor with irrepressible enthusiasm, declaring that although he had no formal attribute, he could still wield plant magic perfectly well. The assistant professor blinked, then stammered in assent. "Okay." From the rear, Chenbi watched, jaw slack. His lips curled downward, not in contempt, but in raw, unguarded envy. Damien, who always seemed to treat everything like a game, was in fact preparing with startling seriousness. Aster, noticing Chenbi's expression, reflected quietly that even Damien was stepping up, and wondered, with faint hope, whether Chenbi might finally break free of his self-imposed shell this time. An announcement then echoed through the field. Starting points would now be assigned. A magical projection bloomed in the center of the yard, displaying each student's designated entrance. Aster located his own name. Starting point 3, his gaze swept across the list. Damien was assigned to point 7. Dahlia's group, Chenbi, point 5. Damien spotted him, waved energetically, and called out, "Friend, see you inside." Chenbi offered a small, hopeful smile and added, "Aster, Damien, let's do well on the test." Aster noted inwardly that they had all been scattered, no shared starting zones. At point 3, he would be grouped with 6 others, complete strangers. The arrangement stirred a familiar unease. It reminded him of his days as a troubleshooter, dropped into hostile territory with a rotating roster of unfamiliar operatives. Awkward, suspicious, unpredictable. He stood still, arms loose, awaiting the next directive, until a group approached. The one in the center stepped forward and asked if he was Aster. Aster did not answer aloud. Instead, he studied the speaker carefully. The boy's bearing was haughty, his expression edged with condescension. An arrogant and punchable face, Aster thought, one he had never seen in Class M3. He seemed out of place, like a noble's retainer slumming among commoners. After a pause, the boy introduced himself as Devay. He claimed to have heard rumors of Aster's skill and wished to make a proposition. Aster responded with a single, cold word. "Speak." Devay's grin widened. He proposed purchasing the test bracelets of those who failed, 30 gold per piece. Excluding Aster and Devay's own group, 3 others remained at point 3. If Aster eliminated them, 90 gold would be his. Aster weighed the offer silently. 30 gold was roughly a month's income for an average commoner family, a staggering sum for a single bracelet. DeVay pressed further, his tone laced with veiled threat. He acknowledged Aster's current patronage under the young master, but warned it would not last forever. It was time, he said, for Aster to learn to fend for himself. Aster did not react outwardly, but inwardly, he conceded DeVay was not entirely wrong. Other students might call such deals cowardly or dishonorable, but these young nobles were simply leveraging what they had: wealth, influence, networks. They were filthy rich. What could one do but admire their efficiency? Good for them, really. Still, he spoke aloud, voice flat. Why 90 gold? DeVay frowned. Was the amount insufficient? Fine, he offered 35 per bracelet, 105 total. Aster shook his head. The math still doesn't add up. He pointed to the 3 unnamed students, then deliberately, to DeVay and his 2 companions. Including you 2, he said. That makes 6. You raised it to 35 per person, that's 210 gold. Now the math checks out. DeVay and his companions froze. DeVay's teeth clenched. What is this loan shark arithmetic? He seethed inwardly. Does this low-born peasant not know his place? Where does he get that kind of confidence? Aloud he snapped. 35 not enough? Fine, 40, no more. Aster smiled. Then the total would be 240 gold. DeVay's arms crossed. He stared, incredulous. Is he insane? Ah, now he understood. This savage was trying to exploit the moment for a massive payout. Blind to the consequences of his own greed. A mad dog indeed. Unfit for the young lady's delicate schemes. He turned to leave, declaring the negotiation over, and ordering Aster to forget the exchange. But Aster's voice stopped him. Where are you going? We can forget about them, but you still have to pay up for your own bracelets. DeVay whirled, eyes blazing. What the? Aster continued calmly, drawing an analogy. If one loaded cargo and passengers onto a carriage, paid for both, then removed the cargo, shouldn't the passenger fare still be due? Then, hand extended, he delivered the line. Pay up, 120 gold, 40 per head. One of DeVay's companions, Facon, exploded forward, shouting that he had endured much but never seen a market thug so brazen. A lowlife daring to rise above his station, unaware that DeVay descended from a baron. DeVay barked his name, Facon, and when the boy halted, he spoke through gritted teeth, voice trembling with suppressed fury. Don't put me in a position where I lose face any more than I already have. After a forced breath, he pulled a pouch from his robes. 120 gold you said, I'll pay it. Inwardly, he repeated a mantra. Endure it. The young lady's orders matter more. A single trade deal with her could multiply our guild tenfold. But as he handed over the coins, Aster's voice returned. Soft, almost polite. Wow. I didn't realize I was standing before someone so distinguished. Then I suppose the unit price will have to increase. Since you're so noble, I'll double your rate. That brings the total to 160 gold. DeVay's fingers tightened around the pouch. He placed the remaining coins into Aster's palm, slowly, deliberately, and whispered with icy finality. From this moment on, I'll show you just how miserable your life can be for 160 gold. You may look forward to it. Time passed. The assistant professor reiterated the rules. If the bracelet's shield shattered, elimination was immediate. The force field activated only against mana-imbued attacks or spells that struck the body directly. Upon shield failure, the wearer would be teleported safely outside. No injury risk. The assistant professor glanced toward Professor Faroon, who, sipping coffee, gave a single, quiet command. Begin. Instantly, warp magic flared beneath the student's feet. One assistant announced, warp complete, displaying internal video feed. Commencing scoring. Faroon's gaze shifted across the monitors. He noted aloud that Dahlia and Damien shared the same starting point. Then, on the third screen, the feed cut to static. An assistant gasped. Huh? What's going on? Another demanded. The screen's gone dead. Didn't you check the magic eye properly? I did, the first insisted. Faroon set his mug down. Enough. I inspected the eyes myself. Which starting point is it? Trembling reply came. That would be starting point 3. Inside the warped space, Aster stood alone in a dim, dripping corridor. He loosened his tie, his face twisted, not in fear, but in cold, simmering fury. As shadows pooled at his feet, he spoke, voice low, venomous, edged with promise. Young masters, I'm adding a 320 gold charge for your insolence.